Thunder cracked across the sky, splitting the darkness with a blinding flash. Rain poured in sheets, turning the narrow mountain path into a treacherous river of mud. Dr. Thomas Hayes urged his horse forward, leaning into the storm, his medical bag clutched tightly against his chest. The message had reached him an hour before a young woman in labor complications, bleeding too much. Every minute counted. The cabin appeared through the curtain of rain, a single lantern burning in the window like a desperate prayer. Thomas dismounted his boots, sinking into the mud as he rushed toward the door. A man yanked it open before he could knock, face ashen in the lamplight. "Thank God," the man breathed, voice breaking. "She's upstairs. The baby, it's coming wrong." Thomas nodded grimly, following the man up creaking stairs to a small bedroom. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the woman's labored breathing. She lay pale against sweat-soaked sheets, her young face contorted in pain. "I'm Dr. Hayes," Thomas said, keeping his voice steady as he set his bag down. "I'm going to help you." The woman's eyes fluttered open, glazed with pain and fear. "My baby," she whispered. "Save my baby." Thomas worked methodically, his hands sure despite the tremor in his heart. The baby was breached, the mother hemorrhaging. He'd seen it before in field hospitals during the war and peaceful bedrooms since. Each time the same cold fear gripped him. Would he be enough? An hour passed in a blur of blood and pain. When the infant finally emerged, a boy, tiny and blue, Thomas cleared his airways with practiced movements. The room held its breath until the child gave a weak cry, his skin slowly pinking. But the mother's blood continued to flow, her pulse weakening beneath Thomas's fingers. He worked desperately, applying every technique he knew, whispering reassurances, even as her eyes grew distant. "Stay with me," he urged. "Your son needs you." The rain drummed against the roof, marking time as her life slipped away. When it was over, when Thomas finally stepped back, his shirt stained crimson, the woman lay still, her face peaceful in death. The husband's accusation cut deeper than any blade. "You should have come sooner," he said, cradling his newborn son while staring at his wife's body. "If you'd been here an hour earlier." "I came as soon as I got word," Thomas replied, his voice hollow. "Not soon enough." Thomas gathered his bloodied instruments with mechanical precision. His face revealed nothing but inside a familiar darkness spread. He handed the man instructions for the infant's care, then turned to leave. At the door he paused, staring out at the relentless rain. "Less the second time I couldn't save a mother," he murmured, his words nearly lost in the storm. "But at least the child lives, unlike my Emma." The husband didn't hear, too consumed by his own grief. But Thomas carried the weight of both as he mounted his horse and rode back into the storm, the ghosts of his failures riding alongside him. Whispering Pines hadn't changed much in the 6 years since Thomas had built his cabin by the river. The town remained a collection of wooden structures straddling the narrow valley, a general store, church, saloon, and the homes of those who hadn't struck gold, but made their living from those who had. The Montgomery Mining Company offices dominated the main street, a 2-story building of imported brick that stood like a monument to Ezekiel Montgomery's success. Thomas tied his horse outside the general store, keeping his head down as he entered. He needed supplies, coffee flour, ammunition, and dreaded the inevitable interaction. Mrs. Jenkins looked up from behind the counter, her dark face softening at the sight of him. "Dr. Hayes," she said, nodding respectfully. "Been a while since we've seen you in town." "Mrs. Jenkins," he placed his list on the counter. "Just the essentials today." She began gathering his items, her movements efficient despite her 60 years. Martha Jenkins had been one of the first freed slaves to settle in Whispering Pines after the war, her skills as a midwife quickly earning her respect, even among those who'd fought for the Confederacy. "Heard you were called to the Peterson place last night," she said, measuring coffee beans into a paper sack. "Sarah Peterson didn't make it, I'm told." Thomas stiffened. "News travels fast." "Always does." She paused, studying him with knowing eyes. "Wasn't your fault, doctor. That baby was coming wrong and she'd been bleeding since morning. Husband waited too long to send for help. A woman is dead, Mrs. Jenkins. A child motherless. And if you hadn't come at all, the child would be dead too." She tied the coffee sack with string. "You can't save everyone, no matter how hard you try." Thomas said nothing, but his hands clenched at his sides. 6 years hadn't dulled the memory of another storm, another death he couldn't prevent. "Montgomery's been asking about you, Mrs. Jenkins said, changing the subject. Something about a council meeting. I have no interest in town politics. Might not be about politics. Heard his daughter's back from Boston. In a delicate condition, they say. Thomas looked up sharply. Abigail, she's with child. Mrs. Jenkins nodded, leaning forward conspiratorially. Unmarried, too. Quite the scandal for a man of Montgomery's position. Word is the father's a musician, a colored man. The bell above the door jangled, interrupting their conversation. Reverend Wallace entered, shaking rainwater from his hat. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of Thomas. Dr. Hayes, he said with forced joviality, good to see you in town. Will we be seeing you at service this Sunday? I doubt it, Reverend. Thomas paid Mrs. Jenkins for his supplies. Good day to you both. Outside, the sky had darkened again, promising more rain. Thomas secured his purchases to his saddle, aware of eyes watching from windows along the street. The ghost doctor. They called him the man who lived alone by the river, who came to town only when necessary, who spoke to the dead. He'd heard the whispers, the superstitions that had grown around his solitude. Let them talk. Their words couldn't touch him anymore. The cabin stood on a gentle rise above Pine River. It was surrounded by tall pines and aspens. Thomas had built it himself after the flood, choosing a spot well above any possible waterline. From his porch, he could see down the valley toward town, but the trees provided privacy, and the constant sound of the river masked his violin when he played at night. Inside, the cabin was sparse but meticulously organized. The main room served as kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace at its center. A desk stood by the window covered with medical journals and patient notes. Shelves lined one wall filled with books on medicine, botany, and surprisingly, music theory. A narrow hallway led to two bedrooms, Thomas's Spartan quarters, and a smaller room he used for storage. But it was the third door, always locked, that contained his past. Thomas lit the lamps as darkness fell, the familiar routine of solitude settling around him. He poured whiskey into a glass, then sat at his desk to review notes from recent patients. The Peterson case would need documentation, another entry in his ledger of lives saved and lost. Thunder rolled in the distance, and Thomas's hands stilled over the page. Storms always brought her back. Sophia standing in their garden in Denver, tilting her face to feel the first raindrops. It's like the sky is playing music, she'd say, laughing. Listen, Thomas. Each drop has its own note. He'd been too busy then building his practice, planning the hospital that would bear his name. Too busy to listen to rain music with his wife, to watch his daughter grow. Until the flood took them both, and suddenly all he had was time and regret. A pounding at his door jolted Thomas from memory. He frowned, setting down his pen. It was nearly 9 and the storm was worsening. Who would venture to his cabin in such weather? The pounding came again, more insistent. Thomas grabbed his revolver from the desk drawer before approaching the door. Raiders weren't common in these parts anymore, but a doctor with morphine and other medicines made a tempting target. Who's there? He called. Open the damn door, Hayes. The voice was unmistakable. Ezekiel Montgomery, the timber still commanding despite the years. Thomas hesitated, then unbolted the door. Wind and rain burst in along with Ezekiel Montgomery, supporting a young woman who appeared near collapse. Her cloak was soaked through her face, hidden beneath its hood. Inside, Abigail, Ezekiel ordered, pushing the woman forward. Quickly now. Thomas stepped back, stunned, as Ezekiel maneuvered the woman, his daughter, into the cabin. In the lamplight, he could see her clearly now. Abigail Montgomery, 20 years old, her face pale with exhaustion and something else, fear. But it was the unmistakable swell of her belly beneath her cloak that caught his attention. Jenkins had been right. She was with child well into her term from the look of it. What is this Montgomery? Thomas demanded, setting his revolver on the table. Ezekiel removed his dripping hat, revealing hair more silver than the brown Thomas remembered. The years had deepened the lines around his eyes and mouth, but hadn't softened the hard set of his jaw. We require your services, Dr. Ezekiel said, helping Abigail to a chair by the fire. Or rather, my daughter does. I'm not a midwife, Mrs. Jenkins in town. This isn't about delivering a baby, not yet. Ezekiel's voice hardened. It's about discretion, something this town seems incapable of providing. Thomas looked at Abigail huddled in the chair, her hands protectively cradling her belly. She hadn't spoken, hadn't even looked up since entering. Miss Montgomery needs proper care, Thomas said. Warm, dry lodgings, her own physician. not an isolated cabin with a doctor she doesn't know. On what she needs, Ezekiel snapped, is to be away from wagging tongues and judgmental eyes until her condition resolves itself. The town council has made that clear. So you've brought her to me. Thomas's voice was flat. Why? Ezekiel straightened, water dripping from his coat onto the wooden floor. I saved your life at Antietam Hayes. Carried you from that field when the rebels had you in their sights. You told me then you owed me a debt. I'm calling it in. The memory surfaced unwillingly, the acrid smell of gunpowder, the screams of the wounded Lieutenant Montgomery appearing through the smoke, hauling Thomas to safety as Confederate bullets kicked up dirt around them. A debt incurred in blood, never repaid. That was 18 years ago. A debt doesn't expire with time. Ezekiel glanced at his daughter. Abigail stays here until the child is born. You provide medical care, shelter, and most importantly, silence. After the birth arrangements will be made for the child and Abigail returns home. And if I refuse, Ezekiel's smile didn't reach his eyes. Then the only other option is the asylum in Denver. Specialists there are quite experienced with hysterical young women. Abigail flinched, the first reaction she'd shown to the conversation around her. Thomas felt cold anger rise within him. The Denver asylum was no place for anyone, let alone a pregnant young woman. He'd seen what happened to patients there, the ice baths, the restraints, the treatments that broke minds rather than healed them. He looked at Abigail again, seeing now the exhaustion in the slump of her shoulders, the fear in the tight grip of her hands on her belly. His doctor's instincts noted her pallor, the slight swelling of her ankle, signs she needed proper care regardless of the circumstances of her pregnancy. You'd send your own daughter to that place? Thomas asked quietly. I'd do whatever necessary to protect the Montgomery name. Ezekiel's tone left no doubt of his resolve. The choice is yours, Hayes. Honor your debt or don't. But know that Abigail's fate rests on your decision. Thomas felt the weight of the young woman's life pressing upon him, alongside the ghosts of those he'd failed to save. Sophia would never have hesitated, would have opened their home to anyone in need. And here was Abigail Montgomery, daughter of the man Thomas suspected had killed his family, needing his help. She can stay, Thomas said, finally looking not at Ezekiel, but at Abigail. I'll care for her until the child comes. Relief flickered across Abigail's face, though she quickly lowered her eyes again. I'm doing this for her, Thomas added, turning to Ezekiel, not for you. The reason doesn't matter, only the result. Ezekiel reached inside his coat and withdrew an envelope. This should cover her expenses. I'll return after the child is born. He moved to the door without another word to his daughter, pausing only to add, remember, Hayes, complete discretion. No one is to know she's here. Then he was gone back into the storm, leaving Thomas alone with Abigail Montgomery and the weight of a decades-old debt. For a long moment, neither spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth and rain lashed against the windows. Abigail remained huddled in the chair, her cloak dripping onto the floor, creating a small puddle at her feet. Thomas sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. You're soaked through. You'll catch your death if you stay in those clothes. Abigail looked up, meeting his eyes for the first time. Hers were a deep blue, rimmed with exhaustion, and what looked like tears she'd been too proud to shed. I'm sorry, she said, her voice softer than he'd expected. I never meant to impose on anyone. Father didn't tell me where we were going until we were halfway here. It's not your fault. Thomas moved to a trunk in the corner, withdrawing a folded nightgown and robe. These were my wife's. They should fit even with your condition. He gestured to a door off the main room. There's a screen in that bedroom. You can change there. I'll make tea. Abigail took the offered clothes, hesitating. Your wife won't mind. A shadow crossed Thomas's face. My wife has been dead for 6 years, as has my daughter. Understanding dawned in Abigail's eyes. The flood. I remember now. I'm sorry, Dr. Hayes. Thomas turned away, moving to the stove to hide the pain that always accompanied mentions of Sophia and Emma. The bedroom will be yours while you're here. I'll take the cot in my study. When Abigail emerged sometime later, she looked marginally better. Sophia's nightgown and robe were a bit short for her taller frame, but otherwise fit well over her swollen belly. She'd removed the pins from her hair, allowing it to fall in damp chestnut waves past her shoulders. Thomas handed her a cup of tea, gesturing for her to sit at the small table by the stove. How far along are you? 7 months, I think. Abigail's hand moved to her belly as she sat. The baby kicks constantly now. Thomas nodded, his clinical gaze assessing her. Any complications? Bleeding, unusual pain, dizziness? No, nothing like that. She sipped the tea cautiously. Just tired. And she hesitated, scared. The admission seemed to surprise her as much as him. Thomas recognized the fear in her eyes. He'd seen it in countless patients facing the unknown. For all her father's wealth and position, Abigail Montgomery was still just a young woman facing childbirth alone, cast out by the very community that should have supported her. Fear is natural, he said, softening his tone, but physically you appear healthy. With proper rest and care, there's no reason to expect anything but a normal delivery when the time comes. Relief flickered across her face. Thank you. They sat in silence for a moment, the awkwardness of their situation hanging between them. Abigail broke it first. People in town call you the ghost doctor, she said, studying him over the rim of her cup. They say you speak to the dead. Thomas's mouth tightened. People say many things when they don't understand grief. I didn't mean to offend you. You didn't. He stood, taking his empty cup to the sink. You should rest now. The journey must have been difficult. Abigail rose obediently, though her expression suggested she had more questions. At the bedroom door, she paused. Dr. Hayes, thank you for not sending me away. Thomas nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. When the door closed behind her, he sank back into his chair, suddenly exhausted. The irony wasn't lost on him, housing the daughter of the man he suspected had destroyed his family. What would Sophia say if she could see him now? He poured himself another whiskey, staring into the amber liquid as if it might contain answers. The weight of the day, Sarah Peterson's death. Ezekiel's unexpected visit, Abigail's arrival pressed down on him like a physical burden. Outside, the storm continued its assault, wind howling through the pines like lost souls seeking shelter. Thomas finished his drink in one swallow, then extinguished the lamps, leaving only the fire's dying embers to light the room. Sleep would be elusive tonight, as it often was, but for the first time in years, he wasn't alone in his cabin. The thought brought no comfort, only the disquieting awareness that his carefully constructed solitude had been breached, and with it the fragile peace he'd built from the ruins of his life. Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit. For a disorienting moment, he wondered why he was sleeping on the cot in his study rather than his bed. Then memory returned. Ezekiel Montgomery, the storm Abigail. He rose quietly, dressing in the dim light filtering through the window. The storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a washed clean world glittering with raindrops. The river ran high and fast beyond his cabin, swollen with mountain runoff. In the kitchen, Thomas built up the fire and set coffee to boil, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man accustomed to solitude. He glanced at Abigail's closed door, wondering if she was still sleeping. Pregnant women often needed more rest, especially after the ordeal of yesterday's journey. A soft sound drew his attention, humming barely audible coming from her room. Thomas paused, listening. The melody was hauntingly familiar, a lullaby he hadn't heard in years. Sophia's lullaby, the one she'd sung to Emma every night. His heart constricted painfully. How could Abigail Montgomery know that song? It wasn't a common tune, but something Sophia had composed herself, a melody that had been theirs alone. The humming stopped, replaced by a whispered conversation. Thomas moved closer to the door, unable to help himself. Don't know where we're going, Abigail was saying softly, but I promise I won't let anyone take away your music the way grandfather did with mine. Thomas stepped back, unsettled. She was talking to her unborn child, a private moment he had no right to witness. But her words echoed in his mind as he returned to the stove. What had she meant about her music being taken away? The bedroom door opened, and Abigail appeared, looking more rested than the night before. She'd braided her hair and put on one of Sophia's day dresses, a simple blue cotton that stretched adequately over her belly. Good morning, Dr. Hayes, she said somewhat shyly. I hope I haven't overslept. No set schedule. Here, Thomas replied, pouring coffee. There's no milk, I'm afraid. Black is fine, thank you. She accepted the cup, then gestured to her borrowed dress. I hope it's all right that I'm wearing this. My own clothes are still damp. It's fine. Thomas kept his voice neutral, though seeing Sophia's dress on another woman stirred complicated emotions. There are more in the trunk if you need them. They ate a simple breakfast of oatmeal and dried apples. The silence between them broken only by the occasional question about the food or weather. Thomas was not a man given to small talk, and Abigail seemed lost in her own thoughts. "I need to check on a patient this morning," Thomas said as they finished. "Mrs. Wilson's rheumatism acts up after storms. I shouldn't be gone more than a few hours." Abigail nodded. "May I look at your books while you are gone? I've always enjoyed reading." "Help yourself to anything except my medical journals. Those are patient records." Thomas hesitated, then added, "And the locked room at the end of the hall is private." Curiosity flickered in Abigail's eyes, but she merely nodded again. "Of course." Thomas gathered his medical bag and hat, giving Abigail instructions about the stove and pantry before he left. As he mounted his horse, he glanced back at the cabin, an unfamiliar unease settling over him. For 6 years, he'd left his home without a second thought, knowing exactly what he'd find upon his return. Now, an unexpected variable had been introduced into his carefully ordered existence. Abigail Montgomery stood at the window watching him go, one hand resting on her swollen belly. Their eyes met briefly before Thomas turned away, urging his horse down the path toward Mrs. Wilson's farm. He tried to focus on the day ahead. Mrs. Wilson's arthritis had stopped at the Richards place to check on their newborn, perhaps a visit to town for more supplies now that he had another mouth to feed. But his mind kept returning to the lullaby Abigail had been humming, a melody that should have been known only to his family. It was probably nothing, he told himself, a coincidence or perhaps his grief-haunted mind playing tricks on him. Yet the unease persisted, a warning that the young woman now living under his roof might disturb more than just his solitude. Abigail waited until Dr. Hayes had disappeared down the path before exploring the cabin. It wasn't snooping, she told herself, just familiarizing herself with her temporary home. After all, she might be here for months. The main room was simple but well-maintained, with worn but clean furniture and a surprising number of books. The kitchen area was basic, a cast-iron stove, a sink with a pump, shelves of preserved foods and dried herbs. Everything was meticulously organized, reflecting the doctor's methodical nature. His bedroom was Spartan, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a dresser, a washstand. No personal items, no photographs. It was as if he lived there but didn't inhabit the space. The study contained a desk covered with papers, a bookshelf of medical texts in the cot where he'd slept. A black medical bag sat open on a side table, surrounded by bottles and instruments. On the wall hung a framed medical degree from Philadelphia College of Medicine, dated 1860. And then there was the locked door at the end of the hall. Abigail stood before it, curiosity warring with respect for Dr. Hayes's privacy. What lay behind it that he wanted to keep hidden? More medical supplies, personal belongings. The baby kicked sharply as if admonishing her for her thoughts. Abigail smiled, placing a hand on her belly. "You're right," she murmured. "It's none of our business." She returned to the main room, selecting a book of poetry from the shelf, Wordsworth. Well worn and marked with notes in a delicate hand different from Dr. Hayes's precise script. His wife's, perhaps. The thought made Abigail handle the volume with extra care. Settling in the chair by the window, she tried to lose herself in the poems, but her mind kept wandering. The doctor was not what she'd expected. From town gossip, she'd anticipated a wild-eyed recluse, perhaps even someone dangerous. Instead, she'd found a man worn by grief but still possessed of kindness, or at least professional concern. Would that change if he knew who the father of her child was? If he knew the full circumstances that had led her to his door? The thought sent a chill through her, despite the warmth of the fire. Her father's warning echoed in her mind. Tell him nothing about the musician. Nothing about Boston. As far as Hayes knows, you're just another fallen woman who made a mistake. But mistakes implied regret, and despite everything, her father's rage, society's condemnation, the uncertain future, Abigail couldn't bring herself to regret loving Elijah. The music they'd made together, both literal and figurative, had awakened something in her soul that had been dormant since her mother's death. The baby kicked again, a reassuring flutter beneath her ribs. Whatever happened, she would have this child, this piece of Elijah, this embodiment of their love. No one, not even her father, could take that away. With that thought providing some comfort, Abigail returned to her book, trying to focus on the words rather than the anxiety that had been her constant companion since discovering her pregnancy. But the poems blurred before her eyes, and soon she dozed off, the book open on her lap, dreaming of music and a future beyond the walls of this isolated cabin. Thomas returned in the late afternoon to find Abigail asleep in the chair by the window, a book of Sophia's poetry on her lap. The sight stopped him in the doorway. The sunlight streaming through the glass, illuminating her face, relaxed in sleep, one hand resting protectively on her belly. For a disorienting moment, he saw Sophia there, pregnant with Emma, dozing in their Denver home while waiting for his return from the hospital. He closed the door more firmly than necessary, banishing the ghost. Abigail startled awake, the book sliding to the floor. "I'm sorry," she said, flustered. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." "Rest is good for your condition." Thomas hung his hat by the door, setting down his medical bag. "I've brought supplies from town. Milk, eggs, fresh bread." "That's very kind. I can prepare supper if you'd like. I'm not much of a cook, but I can manage simple meals." Thomas hesitated. He was accustomed to fending for himself, his meals functional rather than enjoyable. But the offer seemed genuine, and perhaps giving Abigail something to do would be good for her. "If you wish," he said finally. "There's stew meat in the cold box, vegetables in the pantry." Abigail rose, marking her place in the book before setting it aside. As she moved to the kitchen area, Thomas noticed her wince slightly, one hand going to her lower back. "Back pain?" he asked. She nodded. "It's nothing serious, just the weight of the baby." "Sit. Let me examine you first." When she hesitated, he added, "It's why you're here, isn't it?" "For medical care," Abigail acquiesced, settling back in the chair. Thomas knelt before her, his doctor's instincts taking over as he checked her pulse, her swollen ankles, the position of the child. His touch was clinical, impersonal, yet she flinched when his hands pressed gently on her abdomen. "Tender?" he asked. "A little." "The baby's been very active today." Thomas nodded, continuing his examination. "The child is in the proper position, heartbeat strong. Your pulse is slightly elevated, but that's not uncommon in pregnancy. The back pain is normal at this stage, but we'll keep an eye on it." He rose, washing his hands in the basin. "You should take a walk each day, gentle exercise to keep the blood flowing. But rest when you need to. Your body knows what it requires." "Thank you, Derhaze." Abigail smoothed her dress over her belly. "May I ask, have you delivered many babies?" "Enough." Thomas didn't elaborate on the countless births he'd attended during the war in Denver and here in Whispering Pines, or on the ones that had ended like Sarah Peterson's in blood and grief. "Mrs. Jenkins from town will assist when your time comes. She's an excellent midwife." Abigail nodded, though something like uncertainty flickered in her eyes. "And after what happens to the baby after it's born?" Thomas frowned. "Your father mentioned arrangements would be made. I assumed you knew the details." "Father plans to send the child to an orphanage in Denver," Abigail said, her voice growing tight. "He says it's for the best, that I can return to society as if nothing happened." "And is that what you want?" Abigail's hands curled protectively around her belly. "No," she whispered. "But I have no means to support a child on my own. No home except my father's, and he's made it clear the baby isn't welcome there." Thomas studied her face, seeing the conflict there, love for her unborn child warring with the practical realities of her situation. It wasn't his concern, he told himself. His obligation extended to delivering a healthy baby and ensuring Abigail's recovery. What happened after was between her and Ezekiel. Yet something in her expression, the same quiet desperation he'd seen in patients facing impossible choices, struck a chord in him. "There's time yet," he said more gently than he'd intended. "A lot can change in 2 months." Hope flickered briefly in Abigail's eyes before she lowered them, nodding. "Yes, of course, I should start supper." As she moved to the kitchen, Thomas retreated to his study, ostensibly to record notes from his day's visits. But his mind kept returning to the conversation, to the pain in Abigail's voice when she spoke of giving up her child. It wasn't his problem, he reminded himself. He had enough ghosts of his own without taking on the burdens of Ezekiel Montgomery's daughter. Yet as he sat at his desk, staring unseeingly at his patient ledger, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that Abigail Montgomery's presence in his home was not merely the repayment of an old debt, but something more complicated, a test perhaps, or a reckoning long overdue. That night, unable to sleep, Thomas found himself drawn to the locked room at the end of the hall. He unlocked it with the key he always carried, slipping inside as he had countless times before, when memories became too insistent to ignore. Moonlight filtered through the single window, illuminating the room's contents: a grand piano against one wall, a violin case on a small table, shelves of sheet music, and a portrait above the mantel. Sophia, beautiful in her blue concert dress, violin poised under her chin, her expression one of serene concentration. Thomas lit a single lamp, its soft glow creating a circle of light around the piano. He ran his fingers over the keys without pressing them, feeling the smooth ivory cool beneath his touch. Sophia had played every evening, filling their home with Chopin, Beethoven, and her own compositions. Emma had inherited her talent, showing remarkable aptitude even at 4 years old. He moved to the violin case, opening it carefully. The instrument lay nestled in velvet, perfectly preserved strings, still taut, waiting for hands that would never hold it again. Thomas had been a talented violinist once before the war, before medical school consumed his time, before grief stole his desire to create beauty in a world that had taken everything he loved. "I heard her today," he said softly to Sophia's portrait. "Your lullaby for Emma." The Montgomery girl was humming it. The painted eyes gave no answer, no explanation for how a song known only to their family could have found its way to Abigail Montgomery's lips. "It's probably nothing," he continued, needing to convince himself. "A similar melody I've confused in memory." But he knew it wasn't. The lullaby had been unique, Sophia's own creation for their daughter. Its appearance now in his own home, sung by the daughter of the man he suspected had killed his family, couldn't be coincidence. Thomas lifted the violin from its case, holding it as he once had when music came as naturally to him as breathing. His fingers found their places on the strings, muscle memory intact despite the years of disuse. He raised the bow, hesitating on the threshold of sound. Then quietly he began to play. The notes came haltingly, at first his technique rusty, but gradually smoother as his hands remembered their craft. The melody was a Shokin farewell, a lament he'd learned during the war, its haunting strains a fitting accompaniment to the grief that had become his constant companion. As he played, Thomas closed his eyes, allowing the music to carry him back to Sophia, playing this same piece at their wedding, to Emma, clapping in delight at her parents' impromptu concerts, to the life he'd had before the floodwaters took it all away. The final note lingered in the air, a ghost of sound fading into silence. Thomas lowered the violin, his throat tight with unshed tears. This was why he kept the room locked, why he visited only when the weight of memory became unbearable. Music opened wounds he'd spent years trying to cauterize. A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Thomas turned sharply, seeing a shadow move beneath the door. He crossed the room in 3 strides, yanking the door open to find Abigail standing there, her eyes wide with surprise and something else, recognition. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, taking a step back. "I heard music. I didn't mean to intrude." Thomas's grip tightened on the violin. "This room is private. I told you it was locked for a reason." "I know. I'm sorry." Abigail's gaze moved past him to the piano, the shelves of music, Sophia's portrait. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You were a musician." "Once." Thomas moved to block her view. "It's late, Miss Montgomery. You should be sleeping." "You play beautifully," she said, ignoring his dismissal. "That piece, a Shokin farewell, my mother used to play it too." On the piano. Thomas stiffened. "Your mother was a musician." Abigail nodded, a sad smile touching her lips. "She trained at the Boston Conservatory before marrying father. She taught me to play when I was very young." "I wasn't aware Ezekiel's wife had musical talent." "Few were. Father preferred she not perform after they married. Said it wasn't befitting the wife of a businessman to entertain in public." A shadow crossed Abigail's face. "After she died, he sold her piano. Said it took up too much space." Thomas studied her in the lamplight, seeing grief that mirrored his own. "I'm sorry for your loss. It was a long time ago. I was 10. Abigail's hand moved to her belly in what seemed an unconscious gesture. "But I remember her music, the way it filled our home with life." The same could have been said of Sophia, of the way music had been the heartbeat of their family. Thomas felt an unwelcome kinship with this young woman, a shared understanding of loss that transcended their awkward circumstances. "It's late," he said again more gently. "We both should rest." Abigail nodded, turning to go, but paused. "Dr. Hayes, thank you for the music, brief as it was. It's been a long time since I heard a violin played with such feeling." She disappeared down the hall before Thomas could respond, leaving him standing in the doorway of the music room, violin still in hand, unsettled by the encounter. He'd kept this part of himself locked away for 6 years, sharing it with no one. Yet in one night, Abigail Montgomery had glimpsed behind his carefully constructed walls, seeing not just the doctor or the recluse, but the musician he'd once been. Thomas extinguished the lamp and locked the room again, but as he made his way to his study, he knew something had changed. A door had been opened that couldn't easily be closed again, not just to the music room, but to memories and feelings he'd spent years trying to forget. The next morning, an uneasy truce existed between them. Neither mentioned the nighttime encounter, though Thomas caught Abigail glancing at the locked door several times as they went about their day. He showed her his herb garden, explaining which plants aided digestion, which reduced swelling, which helped with sleep, knowledge gleaned from both his formal medical training and what he called the older wisdom of local healers and midwives. Abigail proved an attentive student, asking intelligent questions and quickly grasping the medicinal properties of various herbs. She seemed genuinely interested, not merely making conversation, and Thomas found himself elaborating more than he'd intended. "You have a gift for teaching Dr. Hayes," she observed as they harvested chamomile for tea. "Have you ever considered taking on students?" "No," Thomas replied, perhaps too quickly. "I prefer to work alone." "That seems a shame. Knowledge like yours should be passed on." Thomas straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. "There are medical schools for that purpose. But they don't teach this," Abigail gestured to the herb garden. "The natural remedies, the folk wisdom. My mother used to say the most important lessons aren't found in books." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was." Abigail's expression softened with memory. "She taught me many things before she died. Music, of course, but also to observe the world closely, to listen to what isn't being said as much as what is." Thomas studied her, struck again by the intelligence in her blue eyes. Ezekiel had never struck him as a man who valued such qualities in women, preferring the decorative to the substantive. Perhaps Abigail took after her mother in more than just musical talent. "And what do you observe here, Miss Montgomery?" he asked, curious despite himself. "What isn't being said in this cabin?" Abigail met his gaze steadily. "That you're a man who has lost much more than a wife and child. You've lost your faith in humanity and purpose. In yourself." The assessment, delivered without drama, but with quiet certainty, struck Thomas like a physical blow. He turned away, busying himself with the herbs they'd gathered. "Presumptuous observations from someone who's known me less than 2 days," he said, his voice tight. "Perhaps," Abigail admitted, "but am I wrong?" Thomas couldn't answer without revealing more than he wished. Instead, he changed the subject, explaining the proper drying techniques for the chamomile flowers. Abigail allowed the diversion, but her knowing gaze suggested she'd recognize the evasion for what it was. The days fell into a rhythm after that. Mornings in the garden or gathering herbs in the woods near the cabin. Afternoons with Thomas attending to patients while Abigail rested or read from his library. Evenings spent in what gradually became companionable silence by the fire. Thomas reading medical journals, Abigail knitting small garments for the baby. She never again mentioned the music room, though Thomas sometimes caught her looking at the locked door with longing. And he never asked about the father of her child, though the question burned in his mind. It wasn't his business, he told himself. She would be gone once the baby came back to her father's house, or perhaps to make a new life elsewhere. Their paths had crossed temporarily, nothing more. Yet as the days passed, Thomas found himself growing accustomed to her presence, even looking forward to their conversations. Abigail was well-read and thoughtful, offering perspectives that challenged his own. She had her mother's musical talent and something else, a resilience, a quiet strength that he couldn't help but admire. Sometimes late at night, he heard her humming to her unborn child soft melodies that drifted through the cabin like benevolent ghosts. He never mentioned hearing them, just as she never mentioned when he slipped into the music room during her afternoon rest, playing his violin in whisper-soft tones that wouldn't carry to her ears. It was an unspoken agreement, a mutual respect for each other's private grief and joy. And if Thomas occasionally found himself thinking of Abigail as more than just a patient or an obligation, he quickly suppressed such thoughts. She was Ezekiel Montgomery's daughter, decades his junior, carrying another man's child. Any feeling beyond professional concern was inappropriate and unwelcome. But on a Sunday evening 2 weeks after her arrival, everything changed. The sunset painted the western sky in fiery oranges and purples, reflecting in the river below Thomas's cabin. Abigail sat on the porch watching fireflies begin their nightly dance among the pines. The baby kicked rhythmically inside her, a steady reminder of life's persistence, even in uncertain times. Thomas emerged from the cabin, a steaming mug in each hand. He offered one to Abigail before settling into the chair beside her. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear above the mountains. "I've been thinking," Abigail said finally, her hands cradling the warm mug, "about what happens after the baby comes." Thomas glanced at her profile, gilded by the fading light. "You mentioned your father's plan for the child. Have you made a decision not to give the baby away?" Her voice was soft but firm. "I couldn't live with myself. But beyond that," she shook her head, "I have no prospects, no means of support. Father would never allow us to stay in his home." "Well, the child's father," Thomas ventured carefully. "Could he not provide for you both?" Pain flickered across Abigail's face. "Elijah would if he could. He's a musician, talented, but with little money. And my father—" She stopped, taking a deep breath. "My father made it clear what would happen if Elijah ever returned to Whispering Pines. A threat. More than that, he had men beat Elijah severely, then put him on a train east with nothing but the clothes on his back." Abigail's voice tightened with remembered horror. "I didn't even know if he was alive until a letter came last month, smuggled to me by Mrs. Jenkins. He's in Denver now, teaching music at a new school for colored children." Thomas felt a surge of disgust at Ezekiel's actions, though they didn't surprise him. The man had always been prone to violence when crossed, and he doesn't know about the child. "No." Abigail looked down at her swollen belly. "I found out after he was forced to leave. I tried to write to him, but Father intercepts my mail now. Yet you kept the child knowing the difficulties you would face." Abigail nodded, her expression softening as she placed a hand on her belly. "This baby is part of Elijah, part of me. The only pure thing to come from our love. How could I not keep it?" The simple declaration, delivered without drama, but with absolute conviction, stirred something in Thomas. Respect, certainly, but also a deeper emotion he was reluctant to name. This young woman, barely out of girlhood, showed more courage in the face of societal condemnation than many soldiers he'd known on the battlefield. "Denver isn't so far," he said after a moment. "Once the child is born, perhaps you could go there, find this Elijah." Hope flickered in Abigail's eyes, quickly dimmed by reality. "Father would never allow it. He'd find me, bring me back. Or worse, take the baby and force me to return to Boston." "Your father doesn't own you, Abigail." Thomas surprised himself with the use of her first name, but continued, "You're a grown woman capable of making your own choices." "Am I?" She gave a sad smile. "I've never been allowed to make choices, Dr. Hayes. My education, my friends, my future, all decided by Father. The only choice I ever made for myself was loving Elijah, and look how that ended." Thomas wanted to argue, to tell her she had more options than she realized, but he knew the reality of her situation. Ezekiel Montgomery's influence extended far beyond Whispering Pines. He had money connections, the weight of societal norms on his side. What chance did a young, unmarried mother have against such power? "I'm sorry," he said instead, the words inadequate but sincere. "No one should have their life dictated by another's will." Abigail turned to him, her blue eyes reflecting the last light of day. "Is that why you live out here, away from town, to dictate your own life?" "Partly," Thomas admitted. "After Sophia and Emma died, I couldn't bear the sympathy, the whispers, the well-meaning but painful questions. Here I answered to no one but myself." "And the ghosts," Abigail added softly. "They're here too, aren't they? In the locked room, in the silence between your words." Thomas stilled her perception, unsettling him. "Yes," he said finally, "the ghosts too." Abigail nodded, understanding in her gaze. "I have them as well. My mother, the life I might have had with Elijah, the future I once imagined." Her hand moved protectively to her belly. "But this little one gives me hope, a reason to keep going." The simple statement, offered without self-pity, touched something in Thomas that had been dormant for years. When had he last felt hope? When had he last looked to the future with anything but grim resignation? Before he could respond, the crack of a twig in the darkness snapped both their heads toward the trees. Thomas rose, one hand going to the revolver he'd taken to wearing since Abigail's arrival. "Who's there?" he called, moving in front of Abigail protectively. For a moment, only cricket song answered. Then a figure emerged from the shadow of the pines, hands raised to show they carried no weapon. In the fading light, Thomas could make out a young man tall and lean, with dark skin and intelligent eyes that moved quickly between him and Abigail. "Elijah," Abigail whispered, rising so quickly she nearly stumbled. "Oh my God, Elijah." Thomas caught her arm, steadying her even as his mind processed the implications of the musician's appearance. "Inside," he said quietly. "Both of you, now." As they retreated to the safety of the cabin, Thomas cast one last look at the darkening woods, an inexplicable sense of foreboding settling over him. Elijah Johnson's arrival changed everything, and not he suspected, for the better. The cabin felt smaller with Elijah inside, as if his presence expanded to fill every corner. He stood just inside the door and hat in hand, his gaze fixed on Abigail with an intensity that made Thomas step slightly to one side, and allowing them their moment while remaining watchful. "Abby," Elijah breathed a single word carrying a world of emotion. His eyes moved to her swollen belly, widening with realization. Are you?" "Yes," Abigail said, her voice trembling. "Our child. 7 months along now." Elijah took a halting step forward, then stopped, glancing uncertainly at Thomas. "I don't understand. Why are you here? Mrs. Jenkins said your father had taken you away, but I never imagined." "It's complicated," Abigail said. She turned to Thomas. "Dr. Hayes, this is Elijah Johnson." "Elijah, this is Dr. Thomas Hayes. I've been staying here since Father discovered my condition." Thomas studied the young man before him. Elijah Johnson was perhaps 25, with the lean build of someone who worked with his mind rather than his hands. His clothes were worn but well kept, and he carried himself with quiet dignity despite the obvious tension of the situation. But it was his eyes that caught Thomas's attention, intelligent, wary, and haunted by something that went beyond his current predicament. "Mr. Johnson," Thomas said with a nod, "you've taken a considerable risk coming here." "I had to find Abby," Elijah replied, his voice rich and melodious, even in ordinary speech. "When I got her letter back to—" "Letter," Abigail interrupted. "I never managed to get a letter to you. Father watches the post too carefully." "It came through Mrs. Jenkins," Elijah explained, "forwarded from someone named Martha at the general store. It reached me in Denver last week." Thomas frowned. Martha Jenkins had sent a letter to Elijah without telling him. The midwife had visited twice to check on Abigail's progress, never mentioning any communication with the child's father. "What did this letter say?" he asked. "That Abby was with our child, and staying at a cabin outside town with a doctor named Hayes." Elijah's expression darkened. "That her father planned to send the baby to an orphanage once it was born." Abigail paled. "Mrs. Jenkins knew, but I never told her." "She has ways of knowing things," Thomas said, remembering the midwife's uncanny perceptiveness. "But sending for you was dangerous, Mr. Johnson. If Montgomery discovers you're here—" "I know the risk," Elijah interrupted, "but I couldn't stay away, not after learning Abby was carrying my child." He moved forward, taking Abigail's hands in his. "I should never have left you in the first place." "You had no choice," Abigail said softly. "Father's men would have killed you if you'd stayed." Thomas watched their reunion with mixed emotions. The love between them was evident, genuine in a way that reminded him painfully of what he'd lost. But Elijah's presence complicated an already delicate situation. If Ezekiel discovered the musician had returned, there would be violence, and this time Thomas doubted the young man would escape with mere beatings. "You can't stay in town," Thomas said, breaking in the moment. "Montgomery has eyes everywhere. If he learns you've returned—" "I know," Elijah said, not taking his eyes from Abigail. "I'm staying at an abandoned trapper's cabin about 3 miles west of here. Mrs. Jenkins told me where to find it." "The old Wilson place," Thomas nodded. "Isolated enough, I suppose. But you'll need to be careful. If anyone sees you—" "No one will," Elijah assured him. "I've become good at being invisible when necessary." Something in his tone suggested the skill had been hard-won, a survival mechanism rather than a natural inclination. Thomas studied the young couple, seeing the way they leaned toward each other, hands still clasped as if proximity could make up for months of separation. They deserved privacy for their reunion, he decided, personal complications aside. "I need to check my traps," he said, reaching for his coat. "I'll be back in an hour." Abigail turned to him, gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Dr. Hayes." Thomas nodded, donning his hat. At the door he paused, fixing Elijah with a stern gaze. "Mr. Johnson, Abigail is 7 months pregnant. She needs rest and calm. Remember that." A flush darkened Elijah's cheeks, but he nodded seriously. Yes, sir, I understand. Outside, the night had fully descended, stars pricking the velvet sky above the pines. Thomas had no traps to check. It was merely an excuse to give the young couple time alone, but he found himself reluctant to stray far from the cabin. Instead, he walked to the edge of the clearing, settling on a fallen log, with a clear view of both the cabin and the path leading to it. The air was cool, scented with pine and wood smoke. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called its lonely query echoing through the trees. Thomas pulled his coat tighter, his mind turning over the evening's unexpected development. Elijah Johnson's arrival changed the equation significantly. If the young man truly loved Abigail and was willing to take responsibility for their child, it offered a potential solution to her dilemma. Yet Thomas couldn't shake his unease. Ezekiel Montgomery was not a man who accepted defeat graciously, especially when it came to what he considered his property, and he most certainly viewed his daughter in those terms. Moreover, there was something about Elijah that nagged at Thomas, something beyond the obvious complications of his relationship with Abigail. The name Johnson wasn't uncommon, but in a town as small as Whispering Pines, it triggered a memory Thomas couldn't quite place. The hour passed slowly, the night growing colder as clouds moved in, obscuring the stars. Thomas finally rose, his joints stiff from sitting motionless, and made his way back to the cabin. He knocked before entering, a courtesy he hadn't bothered with since Abigail's arrival, and waited for her soft "come in" before opening the door. Abigail sat by the fire, her face flushed with happiness, despite the tears that had clearly been shed. Elijah stood behind her chair, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder. They looked right together, Thomas thought, like figures in a painting where every element was perfectly balanced. "Thank you for giving us time," Abigail said, wiping her eyes. "There was much to discuss." "I imagine so," Thomas replied, hanging his coat by the door. "Has Mr. Johnson had supper?" "There's stew left from earlier." "Please call me Elijah," the young man said. "And yes, Abby insisted on feeding me, though I told her I'd eaten at Mrs. Jenkins' place before coming here." Thomas nodded, noting the casual familiarity with which Elijah mentioned the midwife. Clearly, Martha Jenkins had been involved in this situation longer and more deeply than she'd let on. "Mr. Johnson, Elijah," Thomas corrected himself. "May I ask how you know Mrs. Jenkins beyond her role in bringing you and Abigail together?" A shadow crossed Elijah's face. "She was a friend of my Uncle Joseph. They came west together after the war, part of the same freedmen's group." "Joseph Johnson," Thomas said, the memory finally clicking into place. "He worked at the lumber mill, lived in a cabin down by the creek." "Yes, sir." Elijah's expression tightened. "Until the floods 6 years ago." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach as the pieces aligned in his mind. "Your uncle was one of the victims," he said quietly. "One of the 8 who died when the dam broke." Elijah nodded, his hand tightening on Abigail's shoulder. "Yes, along with your wife and daughter, Dr. Hayes, and 5 others." Thomas stared at the young man, seeing him with new eyes. Not just Abigail's lover, not just a musician who'd earned Ezekiel Montgomery's wrath, but the nephew of one of the flood victims, a man who had reason to hate Montgomery as much as Thomas did. "You know," Thomas said, the words not quite a question, "about Montgomery's involvement in the dam failure." "I've suspected for years," Elijah replied. "Uncle Joseph had concerns about the dam's construction. He spoke out at town meetings, warned that it wouldn't hold in a major storm. Montgomery dismissed him publicly, called him an uneducated troublemaker." Bitterness crept into his tone. 2 weeks later, the dam broke, and Uncle Joseph's warnings proved tragically accurate. Abigail looked between them, confusion and dawning horror on her face. "What are you saying? That my father, that he knew the dam would fail?" "Not just knew," Thomas said grimly. "Ensured it would in a way that directed the floodwater away from his mining operations and toward the lower valley where the rest of us lived." "That's not possible," Abigail whispered, her face draining of color. "Father can be harsh, even cruel, but he wouldn't deliberately cause deaths." "He couldn't." Thomas moved to his desk, unlocking the bottom drawer with a key he kept around his neck. From it, he withdrew a thick folder, the evidence he and Nathaniel Holt had been gathering for years. "I didn't want to show you this," he said, placing the folder on the table. "It wasn't my intention to come between you and your father, regardless of my suspicions. But with Elijah here, with what he knows," he sighed heavily, "you deserve the truth, Abigail." He opened the folder, spreading its contents across the table maps of the reservoir and surrounding lands, engineering reports on the dam's construction, sworn statements from laborers who had worked on the project. As he explained each piece of evidence connecting the dots of Ezekiel's culpability, Abigail's expression shifted from disbelief to horror to a grief so profound it seemed to age her before his eyes. 8 people, she whispered, her hands protectively cradling her belly. 8 lives, including your family, for what profit? How could he power, Elijah said quietly, control, the same reasons he tried to separate us when he learned of our relationship, the same reasons he sent you here when your pregnancy became known. Abigail's eyes filled with tears. I knew he was capable of cruelty, but this? She looked up at Thomas, her expression stricken. Is this why you agreed to take me in? Because you suspected my father's role in your family's deaths? Thomas hesitated, the question piercing to the heart of his own conflicted motives. When Ezekiel had appeared at his door with Abigail, part of him had indeed seen an opportunity, a chance to have Montgomery's daughter under his roof, perhaps to use her as leverage someday, or at least to repay some small measure of the pain Ezekiel had caused him. But those thoughts had faded as he'd come to know Abigail herself, to see her not as Montgomery's daughter, but as a young woman of intelligence and courage facing circumstances not of her own making. Initially, perhaps, he admitted choosing honesty over comfort. But no, Abigail. Whatever sins your father has committed, they are not yours to bear. His gaze dropped to her belly, nor your child's. Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by renewed distress. What happens now? If what you say is true, if father is responsible for these deaths, he must be held accountable, Elijah said firmly. There must be justice for the lives lost. Justice, yes, Thomas agreed. But how? We have evidence, but Montgomery's influence runs deep. The sheriff, the judge, most of the town council, all are in his pocket, dependent on his mines for their livelihoods. Not everyone, Elijah countered. Mrs. Jenkins, Reverend Wallace, others who remember what Whispering Pines was before Montgomery arrived with his grand plans. And there's something else. He reached into his coat, withdrawing a folded paper. A letter my uncle wrote the day before the flood. I found it among his things afterward. He handed it to Thomas, who unfolded it carefully. The paper yellow with age, the handwriting clear and precise despite the urgency of its message to whom it may concern. I, Joseph Johnson, being of sound mind, do hereby attest that on the night of May 15th, 1872, I witnessed 3 men tampering with the north face of the Montgomery Reservoir Dam. They placed charges at strategic points where the structure was already weakened by poor construction. When confronted, they claimed to be working under direct orders from Ezekiel Montgomery, who had determined the dam would not withstand the coming storm and wished to direct the inevitable failure away from his mining interests upstream. I have brought my concerns to Sheriff Taylor, who dismissed them without investigation. I have written to the territorial governor, but fear my letter will not reach him in time. The storm approaches, and I believe the dam will fail within the next 48 hours. I leave this record in the event I am not able to provide testimony afterward. May God have mercy on us all. Joseph Johnson. Thomas read the letter twice, its simple, straightforward language more damning than any emotional accusation could have been. Why haven't you shown this to authorities? He asked, looking up at Elijah. I tried after the flood. Sheriff Taylor said it was a forgery, that a colored man couldn't write so well. Bitterness edged Elijah's voice. I was 19, alone, grieving. I had no power against men like Montgomery and Taylor. And now, Thomas asked, what's changed? Elijah's expression hardened with resolve. Now I have education connections in Denver, and I have more reason than ever to see justice done. His gaze moved to Abigail. My child will not grow up in the shadow of unpunished crimes. Thomas nodded slowly, understanding the young man's determination. He'd felt the same burning need for justice, had spent 6 years gathering evidence, building a case that might someday bring Ezekiel Montgomery to account. But he'd done so believing that day might never come, that the truth might die with him. Now, with Elijah here with Joseph Johnson's letter adding crucial first-hand testimony to their evidence, perhaps that day was closer than he'd dared hope. Montgomery is hosting the town council meeting at his home this Sunday. Thomas said, a plan forming in his mind. Nathaniel, my investigator, confirmed it yesterday. Every person of influence in Whispering Pines will be there. The perfect opportunity to present our evidence publicly, Elijah said, catching on immediately, where he can't hide from it or dismiss it as the ravings of a grieving doctor. Abigail had been silent during this exchange, her face pale, one hand pressed to her mouth, as if physically holding back her distress. Now she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If you do this, if you accuse my father publicly, what happens afterward? To him, to me and the baby. Thomas and Elijah exchanged glances, neither having considered the full implications for Abigail herself. She would be caught in the middle, daughter of a man exposed as responsible for multiple deaths, lover of a man whose uncle was among the victims. Her position in society, already precarious due to her pregnancy, would be destroyed entirely. I don't know, Thomas admitted, but doing nothing means your father never faces consequences for his actions. 8 people died, Abigail. My wife, my daughter, Elijah's uncle, 5 others. Don't they deserve justice? Tears filled Abigail's eyes. Yes, she whispered. They do, but what kind of justice destroys more lives in the process? Her hand moved protectively to her belly. What about this innocent life? If you expose father, make him a pariah or worse, what happens to us? It was a fair question, one that had no easy answer. Thomas looked to Elijah, seeing the conflict in the young man's face, the desire for justice warring with his love for Abigail and their unborn child. You could come to Denver with me, Elijah said finally. Both of you, we could start fresh there, away from your father's influence. And if he follows, if he uses his connections, his money to find us. Abigail shook her head, fear evident in her eyes. You don't know him like I do, Elijah. He never forgets a slight, never forgives what he sees as betrayal. He would hunt us to the ends of the earth. Then what would you have us do? Elijah asked, frustration edging his voice. Forget the past. Pretend your father isn't responsible for 8 deaths. Allow him to continue wielding power without consequence. Abigail flinched at his tone, and Thomas stepped in before the tension could escalate. It's been a long day for all of us, he said firmly. These are decisions that don't need to be made tonight. He turned to Elijah. It's late and the path to the Wilson cabin is treacherous in the dark. You should stay here tonight. Elijah hesitated, then nodded, the fight going out of him as he saw the exhaustion on Abigail's face. Thank you. I'll leave at first light before anyone might see me. Thomas nodded, retrieving a blanket from a trunk. You can take the cot in my study. I'll sleep out here by the fire. As he arranged makeshift bedding on the floor, Thomas watched Abigail and Elijah say their goodnights. Their whispered conversation too low to overhear. The tenderness between them was evident, but so was the new strain introduced by the revelations of the evening. They had found each other against considerable odds, only to discover that the past might well tear them apart again. Later, as Thomas lay on his pallet before the dying fire, sleep eluded him. The events of the day replayed in his mind: Elijah's unexpected arrival, Joseph Johnson's damning letter, Abigail's distress at learning her father's true nature. They had reached a crossroads, all of them, and whatever path they chose from here would irrevocably alter their lives. Outside, clouds obscured the moon, and a soft rain began to fall, drumming gently on the cabin roof. Thomas listened to its rhythm, remembering how Sophia had loved such nights, calling them nature's lullaby. He closed his eyes, allowing memory to wash over him. Sophia at the piano, Emma asleep upstairs, the same gentle rain falling outside their Denver home. In the darkness, he could almost believe they were still there, waiting for him in rooms just beyond his reach. The thought brought not the usual sharp pain, but a softer ache, a melancholy that was almost sweet in its familiarity. From the study came the soft sound of a harmonica, a mournful melody that somehow complemented his memories rather than intruded upon them. Elijah playing, unable to sleep as well. The music wove through the rain's patter, creating a tapestry of sound that finally lulled Thomas into a dreamless sleep. Morning brought clarity, as it often did. Thomas rose before dawn, finding Elijah already awake, standing at the window watching the eastern sky lighten. They acknowledged each other with nods, respecting the quiet of the early hour. Coffee, Thomas offered, moving to the stove. Thank you. Elijah rolled up the blanket from the cot, folding it neatly. I should go soon, before the town wakes. Thomas nodded, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. Mrs. Jenkins is coming today to check on Abigail. I'll speak with her about your situation, see what she knows that might help us. She's a remarkable woman, Elijah said, a hint of admiration in his voice. Helped raise me after my parents died along with Uncle Joseph. She's the one who encouraged my music, found me my first teacher. Thomas glanced at him, curious. You were raised here in Whispering Pines. I don't recall seeing you before last year. No, in Denver initially. After my parents died influenza when I was 10, Uncle Joseph brought me here. But when I showed aptitude for music, Mrs. Jenkins convinced him to send me back to Denver for proper training. I studied at the Colored Institute there, then at the Conservatory in Boston. Which is where you met Abigail, Thomas surmised, putting the pieces together. Elijah nodded, a small smile touching his lips. She was studying piano at the Ladies' Academy nearby. We met at a concert, Beethoven's Seventh Symphony. She dropped her program, I retrieved it, and he shrugged, the gesture eloquent in its simplicity. The world changed. The quiet happiness in Elijah's voice as he recounted the meeting struck Thomas deeply, reminding him of another chance encounter. Another instant connection. Sophia, after a performance in Philadelphia, still in her concert dress, her violin case in hand, as she accepted his awkward compliments on her playing. Love at first sight, Thomas murmured, almost to himself. I didn't believe in such things before, Elijah admitted. But yes, from the moment I saw her. The coffee began to percolate, its rich aroma filling the cabin. Thomas retrieved 2 mugs, pouring the steaming liquid for both of them. Montgomery sent her to Boston after her mother died, he said. To become a proper lady, I suppose. To forget her mother's influence. Elijah corrected, accepting the mug with a nod of thanks. Rebecca Montgomery was a gifted musician, educated, independent-minded. Everything Ezekiel resented and feared in women. He sent Abigail away to ensure she wouldn't follow in her mother's footsteps. Yet she did anyway, Thomas observed. Finding music, finding you. Finding herself, Elijah said softly. The self her mother wanted her to be, not the ornament her father intended. They drank their coffee in companionable silence, each lost in thought. The eastern sky had brightened to pale gold, promising a clear day after the night's rain. I should go, Elijah said, finally setting down his empty mug. Will you tell Abigail I'll return tonight after dark? We have more to discuss. Thomas nodded. Be careful. If Montgomery's men are watching the cabin— They aren't, Elijah interrupted with certainty. I checked thoroughly before approaching yesterday. No one is watching this place. How can you be so sure? A hint of steel entered Elijah's voice. Because I spent 3 years with the Pinkerton Agency in Denver before returning to music. I know how to spot surveillance, Dr. Hayes. It was part of my job. Thomas raised an eyebrow, reassessing the young man before him. A Pinkerton detective. That's an unusual occupation for a musician. I needed money for the conservatory. Elijah explained, a defensive edge to his tone. The agency was hiring colored men for certain types of work investigations in communities where white detectives couldn't blend in. The pay was good, the hours flexible enough to allow me to continue my studies. I meant no offense, Thomas said. I'm just surprised. It explains your caution, your attention to detail. Elijah relaxed slightly. Skills that have proven useful in more ways than I expected. He donned his hat, moving toward the door. I'll be back after nightfall. Please give Abigail my love. After Elijah departed, disappearing into the trees with a silence that spoke to his training, Thomas sat alone with his thoughts. The young man was more complex than he'd initially appeared. Musician, former detective, devoted lover, and now expectant father, seeking justice for his murdered uncle. In another life, Thomas might have seen a kindred spirit in Elijah Johnson, another man whose path had been shaped by loss and the search for meaning beyond it. But in this life, their connection was Abigail. And through her, Ezekiel Montgomery, the man who had altered all their fates with his greed and callousness. Whatever happened next would be determined by how they chose to address that shared injury and whether justice or mercy would guide their actions. The sun had fully risen now, painting the cabin in golden light. From Abigail's room came the sound of movement. She was awake, ready to face a day that would inevitably bring difficult conversations and painful choices. Thomas rose to prepare breakfast, knowing that food at least was a simple comfort he could provide. Mrs. Jenkins arrived mid-morning, her wagon pulling up to the cabin with its usual clatter. Thomas met her at the door, helping her down with the supplies she'd brought: fresh bread, eggs, dried fruit, and herbs for Abigail's care. You look tired, Doctor, she observed, her keen eyes missing nothing. Trouble sleeping. Unexpected visitors tend to disrupt one's rest, Thomas replied pointedly, particularly when they arrive without warning. Mrs. Jenkins smiled unperturbed by his implied criticism. I imagine young Mr. Johnson's appearance was quite a surprise. A surprise you orchestrated, Thomas countered, keeping his voice low so Abigail resting in her room wouldn't overhear. Why didn't you tell me you'd contacted him? Would you have approved if I had? That's beside the point. No, doctor, that is precisely the point. Mrs. Jenkins set her basket on the table with quiet authority. That girl in there is carrying a child whose father has every right to know of its existence. Whatever complications that creates for you or Ezekiel Montgomery is secondary to what's right. Thomas couldn't argue with her logic, though the timing of Elijah's arrival still struck him as problematic. Montgomery will be here on Sunday to check on Abigail. If he discovers Johnson has returned, he won't, Mrs. Jenkins said confidently. Elijah knows how to stay hidden when necessary. She began unpacking her basket, arranging herbs and medicines with practiced precision. Now, how is our mother-to-be this morning? Thomas recognized the subject change for what it was, but allowed it. Tired, emotional given yesterday's revelations. The baby seems active, but there are no signs of distress. Mrs. Jenkins nodded approvingly. Good, and her spirits, before Elijah's arrival, I mean. Better than might be expected, given her circumstances. Thomas hesitated, then added, She's strong, Mrs. Jenkins, resilient in ways her father probably never noticed. Like her mother, the midwife said softly. Rebecca had a core of steel beneath her gentle exterior. Ezekiel never saw it, or if he did, he spent years trying to break it. She looked up, meeting Thomas's gaze directly. He failed with Rebecca, and he'll fail with Abigail too. Thomas studied the older woman, struck by the personal knowledge in her tone. You knew Rebecca Montgomery well. I delivered Abigail, Mrs. Jenkins said simply. Stayed with Rebecca through a difficult birth when Ezekiel was away on business. Some bonds go beyond social standing or color, Dr. Hayes. Rebecca understood that even if her husband didn't. Before Thomas could pursue this intriguing glimpse into the past, Abigail emerged from her room, face brightening at the sight of the midwife. Mrs. Jenkins, she greeted warmly, it's so good to see you. And you, child. The older woman embraced Abigail with genuine affection. Let me look at you properly. Yes, good color, clear eyes. The little one treating you well as can be expected. Abigail smiled, one hand moving to her belly. Though she seems to be practicing dance steps rather than lullabies lately. Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. You think it's a girl? Abigail nodded, a certainty in her expression that intrigued Thomas. I'm sure of it. I dream of her sometimes, a little girl with Elijah's eyes and my mother's hands. Musical hands. Mrs. Jenkins smiled knowingly. Mothers often have a sense about these things. She turned to Thomas. If you'll excuse us, doctor, I need to examine Abigail properly. Thomas nodded, reaching for his hat. I'll check my snares. Give you ladies your privacy. Outside, the day had warmed considerably, the sun burning off the last of the morning mist. Thomas walked slowly along the path to the creek. Not really expecting to find anything in the snares he occasionally set, they were more habit than necessity, a connection to the self-sufficiency he'd cultivated since moving to the cabin. His mind turned over the morning's conversation with Mrs. Jenkins, particularly her mention of delivering Abigail. It suggested a connection to the Montgomery family that went deeper than he'd realized, one that might explain her willingness to defy Ezekiel by contacting Elijah. More intriguing was Abigail's certainty that she carried a daughter. Thomas had heard such claims from expectant mothers before and had generally dismissed them as wishful thinking. But there had been something in Abigail's eyes as she described her dreams, a knowing that went beyond mere hope. The first snare was empty, as was the second. At the third, Thomas found a rabbit already cold. He reset the trap after collecting his catch, moving with the efficiency of long practice. The rabbit would make a good stew, and with Mrs. Jenkins's fresh bread, a satisfying meal. As he worked, Thomas considered the coming Sunday and what it might bring. If he and Elijah proceeded with their plan to confront Ezekiel at the town council meeting, the consequences would be far-reaching for all of them. Yet if they remained silent, allowed Montgomery to continue unchallenged, would they ever find peace? Would the ghost that haunted them, Sophia, Emma, Joseph Johnson, ever rest? And what of Abigail and her unborn child? Whatever path they chose would irrevocably alter her future as well. She deserved a voice in this decision, perhaps more than any of them. With the rabbit secured to his belt, Thomas headed back toward the cabin, his resolve firming with each step. Before any plans were made final, before any actions were taken that couldn't be undone, the three of them, Abigail and Elijah, needed to speak openly to understand fully what each was willing to risk and what each hoped to gain. Justice without considering the cost to the innocent was no justice at all, merely another form of the very blindness that had allowed Ezekiel Montgomery to sacrifice 8 lives for his own benefit. Mrs. Jenkins' wagon was gone when Thomas returned, but another visitor had arrived in his absence. Nathaniel Holt sat at the kitchen table, his angular frame seeming too large for the simple wooden chair, a mug of coffee cooling before him as he spoke with Abigail. "Hayes," Holt greeted, rising as Thomas entered. "Good hunting, I see." Thomas nodded, setting the rabbit aside. "Nathaniel, I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." "Plans change." The detective's weathered face was grim. "We need to talk." Thomas glanced at Abigail, who was watching them with apprehension. "Miss Montgomery, would you excuse us? Nathaniel and I have business to discuss." Abigail rose, one hand automatically supporting her lower back. "Of course, I'll rest for a while." She nodded politely to Holt before retreating to her room, closing the door softly behind her. "Montgomery's daughter," Holt said once they were alone, his tone flat. "You didn't mention you were harboring her." "It wasn't relevant to your investigation," Thomas replied, pouring himself coffee. "Wasn't relevant." Holt's eyebrows rose. "Having the daughter of our primary suspect under your roof seems damn relevant to me, Hayes. She's here temporarily under my medical care. Her father brought her to me, ironically enough." Holt snorted. "Montgomery's got some nerve asking for your help after what he did." "He doesn't know that I know," Thomas reminded him. "As far as he's concerned, I'm just the reclusive doctor who owes him a debt from the war. And the girl, what does she know?" Thomas hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. Nathaniel Holt had been a valuable ally in his quest for evidence against Montgomery, but the man's hunger for justice sometimes bordered on obsession, making him unpredictable. "She knows everything," he said finally, "about the flood, her father's involvement, all of it." Holt swore under his breath. "You told her? What were you thinking, Hayes? She could warn him, destroy everything we've worked for." "She won't," Thomas said with certainty. "She's as shocked and horrified as anyone would be. Besides, she has her own reasons to distrust her father now." "The baby," Holt surmised, gesturing toward Abigail's closed door. "Montgomery's not pleased about becoming a grandfather out of wedlock, I take it." "That's putting it mildly." Thomas took a seat across from the detective. "But that's not why you're here, is it? What's happened?" Holt's expression darkened. "William Reynolds is dead." Thomas stilled the name, immediately registering. Reynolds was the former mine worker who had signed a statement confirming he had helped install the explosives that weakened the dam under Montgomery's orders. His testimony was crucial to their case. "How?" Thomas asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Found him behind the saloon this morning, throat cut ear to ear." Holt's voice was hard with suppressed anger. "No witnesses, no suspects. Sheriff Taylor's calling it a robbery gone wrong." "Convenient timing," Thomas observed bitterly, "just days before the town council meeting where we planned to present his testimony." "Too convenient," Holt agreed. "Someone knew we were building a case, Hayes. Someone warned Montgomery." The implication hung between them, unspoken but clear. Their investigation had been compromised, possibly by someone close to them. "What about the written statement?" Thomas asked. "Reynolds signed an affidavit. We still have that." "It's his word against Montgomery's, and Reynolds isn't around to back it up anymore." Holt shook his head. "Without him testifying in person, the statement loses much of its power. Montgomery will claim it was coerced or forged." Thomas absorbed this setback, his mind racing to evaluate their position. Reynolds' death was a serious blow, but not a fatal one. They still had the engineering reports, the maps showing how the floodwaters had been deliberately channeled, and now, crucially, Joseph Johnson's letter. "There's something else," he said, deciding to trust Holt with this new development. "Elijah Johnson has returned to Whispering Pines." Holt's head snapped up, surprise evident in his gaze. "Joseph Johnson's nephew, the musician who got Montgomery's daughter in trouble." "The same. He's staying at the old Wilson cabin west of here." "Does Montgomery know he's back?" "Not yet," Thomas said, "and we need to keep it that way at least until Sunday." "Why, what happened Sunday?" "Johnson has a letter written by his uncle the day before the flood. It details seeing men tampering with the dam men who claimed to be working under Montgomery's orders. Thomas leaned forward, his voice low with intensity. It's first-hand testimony, Nathaniel, from a man who died in the very flood he was warning about. Hope flickered in Holt's eyes, quickly tempered by caution. The word of a dead colored man against Ezekiel Montgomery, most folks in this town would laugh it off. Not if it's presented alongside our other evidence. Not if it's presented publicly at the town council meeting where Montgomery can't control the narrative. Holt studied him, understanding dawning in his gaze. You're planning to confront him at his own house in front of the council. We are, Thomas confirmed. Johnson and I. It's time, Nathaniel. 6 years is long enough to wait for justice. A slow smile spread across Holt's face, though it held no warmth. I've waited for this day since they pulled my cousin's body from that floodwater haze. Sophia was more sister than cousin to me. I promised her grave I'd make Montgomery pay for what he did. Thomas had almost forgotten that Sophia and Nathaniel were related, so focused had he been on his own loss. The reminder explained much about Holt's dedication to their cause, his willingness to spend years gathering evidence that might never lead to conviction. Then you're with us? Thomas asked. To the end, Holt confirmed, whatever that may be. They spent the next hour reviewing their evidence, adjusting their strategy to account for Reynolds' death and the addition of Joseph Johnson's letter. The case against Montgomery remained strong if circumstantial. Whether it would be enough to convince the town councilmen who owed their positions and prosperity largely to Montgomery's mines remained to be seen. As Holt prepared to leave, gathering his notes and hat, he paused, glancing toward Abigail's closed door. The girl, he said quietly, what happens to her after all this? Have you considered that? Thomas had been asking himself the same question since Elijah's arrival. Johnson wants to take her to Denver, he said. Start a new life there, away from her father's influence. And you think Montgomery will just let them go after being publicly accused of murder? Holt shook his head. He'll come after them, Hayes. You know he will. Then we'll need to ensure he can't, Thomas said firmly. Whether that means legal constraints or other measures. Something dangerous flickered in Holt's eyes. Other measures. Yes, I suppose those might be necessary. The implication troubled Thomas, but he didn't pursue it. Nathaniel Holt had lost family in the flood too, had his own right to justice. If his version of that justice took a darker turn than Thomas might prefer, well, that was a bridge they'd cross when they came to it. Sunday, Holt said, donning his hat. I'll be there with everything we have. After the detective departed, Thomas remained at the table, the weight of their plans heavy on his shoulders. They were committed now, the machinery of confrontation set in motion. Whatever happened Sunday would change all their lives irrevocably. His Abigail's, Elijah's, and most certainly Ezekiel Montgomery's. He could only hope that when the dust settled, justice would have been served without creating new victims in the process. The afternoon passed quietly with Thomas preparing the rabbit for stew while Abigail rested. When she emerged from her room, her face showed signs of recent tears, though she offered a small smile as she joined him in the kitchen. Can I help? She asked, gesturing to the vegetables he was chopping. If you feel up to it, Thomas replied, making space for her at the table. Mrs. Jenkins said you're doing well, though she emphasized the need for rest. Abigail nodded, taking up a knife to slice carrots. She's been very kind, as have you, Dr. Hayes. They worked in companionable silence for a time, the rhythmic sound of chopping, punctuated only by the occasional log settling in the fire. Thomas found himself oddly content in this simple domestic task, shared with someone after years of solitary meals. I heard Mr. Holt's news, Abigail said finally, her voice careful, about the witness who died. Thomas glanced at her, not surprised she'd overheard. The cabin's walls were thin, and Holt had made little effort to keep his voice down. Yes, it complicates matters. You still intend to confront my father on Sunday? We do. Thomas added the vegetables to the pot, adjusting the heat. Reynolds' death makes it more urgent, not less. If your father is eliminating witnesses— You don't know it was him, Abigail interrupted, though her voice lacked conviction. It could have been a robbery, like the sheriff said. Could have been, Thomas agreed, not wanting to argue. But the timing is suspicious, to say the least. Abigail set down her knife, one hand moving to her belly in what had become a habitual gesture when she was distressed. I keep thinking about what you showed me yesterday, the evidence against father. Part of me still can't believe he would deliberately cause deaths, even for profit. People are capable of terrible things when power and money are at stake, Thomas said gently, even those we think we know. I thought I knew him, Abigail whispered. All my life I thought I understood who my father was, harsh, controlling, but fundamentally concerned with our family's welfare. Now, she shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. Now I wonder if I ever knew him at all. Thomas felt a surge of compassion for her. Whatever his own grievances against Ezekiel Montgomery, Abigail was suffering the particular pain of discovering a parent's moral bankruptcy, a disillusionment that struck at the very foundation of her identity. Our parents are human, he said carefully, flawed, fallible. We build them into giants when we're children, only to discover their clay feet as we grow older. Clay feet are one thing, Abigail replied. Causing 8 deaths for profit is something else entirely. Thomas couldn't argue with that. Instead, he stirred the stew, allowing Abigail space for her thoughts. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice steadier. If you do this, if you publicly accuse my father, what do you expect will happen? It was a fair question, one Thomas had been asking himself since formulating the plan with Elijah. Best case, the evidence is compelling enough that the town council initiates an investigation, perhaps brings in the territorial governor. Your father faces legal consequences for his actions. In worst case, Thomas hesitated, unwilling to voice his darkest fears. Worst case, nothing changes. Montgomery's influence is too great, the council too dependent on his money and power. The accusations are dismissed, and we're back where we started. No, Abigail said softly. That's not the worst case. The worst case is violence, my father retaliating against you, against Elijah. More deaths adding to those already on his conscience. Her hand tightened protectively over her belly. More orphans, more grief. The simple, stark assessment cut through Thomas's carefully constructed justifications. Abigail was right, of course. Confronting Ezekiel Montgomery publicly carried risks beyond mere failure. Risks that extended to all of them, including her unborn child. What would you have us do? He asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Allow your father to escape justice for what he's done, pretend the past never happened. No, Abigail said, surprising him with her firmness. Justice must be served, but perhaps there's a way that doesn't risk more lives in the process. She looked up, meeting his gaze directly. Will you at least discuss alternatives with Elijah when he returns tonight, before committing to a course that might bring more harm than healing? Thomas recognized the wisdom in her request, even as part of him resisted any delay in the confrontation he'd been planning for years. But Abigail deserved a voice in this decision, given how profoundly it would affect her future. We'll discuss it, he promised. All of us together. Relief softened Abigail's features. Thank you. As they finished preparing the meal, Thomas found himself watching Abigail with new eyes. The young woman who had arrived at his cabin 2 weeks ago, frightened, uncertain, at the mercy of her father's dictates, had changed subtly but significantly. There was a quiet strength emerging in her, a clarity of thought that commanded respect. Whatever path they chose on Sunday, Thomas realized would be shaped not just by his and Elijah's desire for justice, but by Abigail's voice as well, a voice that spoke for the future as much as for the past. Night had fallen by the time Elijah returned, slipping through the darkness with the same silent efficiency that had marked his departure. Thomas met him at the door, a finger to his lips, warning for quiet. Abigail had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire, exhausted by the emotional toll of the day's revelations. She's been waiting for you, Thomas said softly, leading Elijah into the kitchen where they could speak without disturbing her. It's been a difficult day. Nathaniel Holt was here, Elijah observed, removing his hat. It wasn't a question. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You saw him. I watched the cabin most of the day from the ridge, Elijah explained unapologetically. Habit from my Pinkerton days. I saw him arrive and leave. He brought news, Thomas said grimly. William Reynolds is dead, murdered behind the saloon last night. Elijah's expression hardened, though he showed no surprise. I heard rumors in town. Mrs. Jenkins mentioned a body had been found. You went into town, Thomas asked sharply. That was reckless. I was careful, Elijah assured him. Kept to the colored section stated with the people I trust. No one who would report to Montgomery saw me. Thomas wasn't convinced, but let it pass. Reynolds' death complicates our plans. He was our primary witness of the man who actually placed the charges that weakened the dam. But we still have my uncle's letter, Elijah pointed out, and the other evidence you've gathered. It's enough, Dr. Hayes. It has to be. Before Thomas could respond, a soft sound from the main room drew their attention. Abigail had woken and was watching them from the doorway, one hand supporting her lower back, the other resting on her swollen belly. Elijah, she said, her voice warm with relief. You're back. Elijah crossed to her, immediately taking her hands in his. I told you I would be. The tenderness in the simple exchange moved Thomas unexpectedly. How long had it been since he'd experienced such a moment? The quiet joy of reunion, the comfort of presence. Since Sophia and Emma's deaths, he'd existed in a state of emotional suspension, neither fully alive nor truly dead, merely enduring. You two should talk, he said, reaching for his coat. I'll check the wood pile, make sure we have enough for the night. Outside, the air was crisp, with the first hint of autumn stars pricking the velvet sky above the pines. Thomas busied himself stacking firewood on the porch, giving the young couple privacy, while remaining close enough to hear if they called for him. The night was peaceful, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of nocturnal creatures disturbing the silence. It was hard to believe that in just 4 days this tranquility would be shattered by their confrontation with Ezekiel Montgomery. Whatever the outcome, nothing would be the same afterward. Thomas had just finished arranging the last of the logs when he heard raised voices from inside. He paused, listening. Elijah and Abigail were arguing, their words indistinct, but their tones clear, his insistent hers pleading. He hesitated, torn between respecting their privacy and concern for Abigail's condition. Strong emotions weren't good for a woman in her third trimester. Before he could decide, the cabin door opened and Elijah strode out, his face tight with frustration. Mr. Johnson, Thomas began, but Elijah waved him off. I need air, the younger man said curtly, heading toward the tree line. Thomas watched him go, then entered the cabin to find Abigail standing by the fire, tears streaming down her face. What happened? He asked, gently closing the door against the night chill. Abigail wiped her cheeks, trying to compose herself. We disagree about Sunday, about confronting my father. I gathered as much, Thomas said, guiding her to a chair. Sit, please. Agitation isn't good for the baby. She obeyed, sinking into the chair with a weariness that concerned him. Elijah wants justice, and I understand that. I do, but he's talking about more than just presenting evidence, Dr. Hayes. He's talking about making sure my father pays one way or another. Thomas frowned, hearing echoes of Nathaniel Holt's ominous tone earlier. What exactly did he say? That if the law won't hold my father accountable, there are other ways to ensure justice. Abigail's voice trembled. I'm afraid he's thinking of taking matters into his own hands. The possibility had occurred to Thomas as well. Elijah Johnson had lost his uncle to Montgomery's greed, had been beaten and driven from town on the man's orders, had been separated from the woman he loved. His reasons for wanting revenge went beyond abstract justice. I'll speak with him, Thomas promised. Make him see reason. Will you, Abigail asked, her blue eyes searching his face. Or do you agree with him, after all you lost even more than Elijah did because of my father? The question struck at the heart of the Thomas's own conflicted feelings. For 6 years, he'd lived with the knowledge that Ezekiel Montgomery was responsible for his family's deaths. For 6 years, he'd gathered evidence, built a case, waited for the right moment to seek justice. But what form did he truly want that justice to take? I want your father to face legal consequences for his actions, he said carefully, to be tried and sentenced according to the law. But if that doesn't happen, Abigail pressed, if the town council dismisses the evidence, if nothing changes, what then? Thomas couldn't answer. The truth was, he didn't know what he would do if Montgomery escaped legal justice yet again. The rage that had fueled him these past 6 years had tempered somewhat with time, but it still burned beneath the surface, ready to flare at the slightest provocation. Let me speak with Elijah, he said instead. We need to be united in our approach, whatever we decide. Abigail nodded, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. Please, make him understand that violence will only beget more violence. That our child deserves a father who's free, not one imprisoned or hanged for murder. The stark reality of her words chilled Thomas. He'd been so focused on the past, on justice for the dead, that he'd given too little thought to the living, to Abigail and her unborn child, to the future that hung in the balance. Rest, he told her. I'll find him, talk some sense into him. Outside, the night had deepened, the temperature dropping further. Thomas followed Elijah's tracks in the soft earth leading away from the cabin toward the river. He found the young man sitting on a boulder overlooking the water, his silhouette dark against the starlit sky. She sent you to find me, Elijah said without turning. It wasn't a question. She's concerned, Thomas replied, moving to stand beside him. As am I. About what? That I'll kill Montgomery. Elijah's voice was bitter. That I'll do what the law won't. Would that bring your uncle back? Or my wife and daughter? Thomas asked quietly. Would it give Abigail and your child the future they deserve? Elijah didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the river flowing black and silver beneath the stars. When I was with the Pinkertons, he said finally, I saw how justice worked for men like Montgomery, how money and influence could bend the law until it broke, how the powerful rarely paid for their crimes. So you've already decided the town council will do nothing, Thomas observed. Haven't you? Elijah turned to look at him, his eyes reflecting starlight. Be honest, Dr. Hayes. Do you truly believe Montgomery will face legal consequences on Sunday? Thomas wanted to say yes to affirm his faith in justice and the law, but honesty compelled him to shake his head. No, he admitted, the odds are against it. The council members are largely in his pocket, dependent on his mines for their livelihoods. Then what's the point? Elijah asked, frustration edging his voice. Why confront him at all if nothing will change? Because the truth matters, Thomas said simply. Because keeping silent makes us complicit in his crimes. Because even if he escapes legal punishment, the town should know what kind of man they have allowed to lead them. Elijah seemed to consider this, his expression thoughtful in the dim light. And if knowing changes nothing, if he remains as powerful, as untouchable as before, then we find another way, Thomas said, one that doesn't involve more bloodshed, more lives destroyed. What other way is there? Thomas had been asking himself the same question since Abigail raised her concerns. Now an idea began to form in his mind, not a perfect solution, perhaps, but one that might offer a path forward. Montgomery values two things above all else, he said slowly, his reputation and his business interests. If we can't reach him through the law, perhaps we can reach him through those. Elijah straightened, interest flickering in his eyes. What are you suggesting? That we give him a choice, Thomas explained. Public exposure of his crimes with all the damage that would do to his standing in the community and his business relationships beyond Whispering Pines, or a private arrangement that serves justice in another way. What kind of arrangement? Financial compensation to the families of those who died. A substantial contribution to build the hospital this town has needed for years. And most importantly, his agreement to leave Abigail, you and your child alone, to allow you to build a life together without his interference. Elijah considered this skepticism evident in his expression. You think Montgomery would agree to that? Give up control of his daughter, pay reparations, all to avoid public shame. I think he might, Thomas said. Ezekiel Montgomery is many things, but stupid isn't one of them. He understands the value of compromise when the alternative is worse. And if he refuses, if he calls our bluff, then we proceed as planned. We present our evidence publicly. Let the consequences fall where they may. Thomas placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. But violence cannot be our fallback position, Johnson. It would destroy everything you and Abigail hope to build. Elijah's shoulders slumped slightly, the fight going out of him. I know, he admitted quietly. When I'm with her, when I feel our child move beneath my hand, I know that. But when I think of my uncle, of your family, of what Montgomery took from us all, he shook his head. The rage blinds me sometimes. I understand what Thomas said, and he did. How many times had he fantasized about confronting Montgomery with a gun rather than evidence? How many nights had he lain awake imagining scenarios where he took justice into his own hands? But we must be better than our rage for Abigail's sake, for the child's. Elijah nodded slowly, his expression clearing. You're right, and your alternative approach, it has merit. Montgomery might indeed value his reputation enough to compromise. We'll present it to Abigail, Thomas said. See what she thinks. This affects her most of all. They walked back to the cabin side by side, their footsteps crunching on fallen pine needles. The night was peaceful around them, the stars brilliant in the clear mountain sky. Thomas felt a cautious optimism taking root. Perhaps there was a way forward that honored the dead, without sacrificing the living that brought a measure of justice, without perpetuating the cycle of violence. As they approached the cabin, warm light spilling from its windows into the darkness, Thomas was struck by how this place, built as a sanctuary for his solitary grief, had become something else entirely. A haven for three damaged souls seeking healing, a crucible where past and future collided, a crossroads where choices made would ripple outward to touch many lives beyond their own. Whatever happened Sunday, nothing would be the same afterward. But perhaps, just perhaps, it could be better. The next morning, Thomas woke to the smell of coffee and the soft murmur of voices from the kitchen. He rose from his pallet by the fire where he'd slept to give Elijah and Abigail privacy in the bedroom and study respectively. The conversation paused as he entered the kitchen, finding them seated at the table, hands clasped together, expressions serious but calm. "Good morning," he greeted, pouring himself coffee. "Dr. Hayes," Abigail acknowledged with a small smile. "We've been discussing your suggestion from last night about approaching my father privately before the council meeting." Thomas nodded, taking a seat across from them. "And I think it might work," she said, her voice cautiously hopeful. "Father values his reputation above almost everything. The threat of public humiliation might be enough to make him agree to your terms." "Almost everything," Elijah emphasized, his expression less convinced. "He also values control, particularly over you. Giving that up won't come easily to him." "No," Abigail agreed. "But if the alternative is public disgrace, financial ruin—" She shook her head. "He's a practical man beneath the pride and ambition. He'll calculate the condom and make the choice that preserves the most of what he values." Thomas studied her, impressed again by her clear-eyed assessment of her father's character. "Then we're agreed we approach Montgomery privately on Sunday before the council meeting, offer him our terms." Elijah nodded, though reluctance lingered in his gaze. "Agreed. But we should be prepared for him to refuse. Have our evidence ready, be willing to follow through on our threat if necessary." "Of course," Thomas said. "Nathaniel will be at the meeting with copies of everything we've gathered, and you'll bring your uncle's letter." "There's something else," Abigail said, her hand moving to her belly in what had become a habitual gesture. "If Father agrees to our terms, I want something specific included." "What's that?" Thomas asked. "The truth about my mother's death," she said, her voice steady despite the pain in her eyes. "I've always believed she died of influenza, but now I'm not so certain. There were rumors, whispers among the servants that never reached my ears directly." Thomas frowned. "You think Montgomery had something to do with your mother's death?" "I don't know," Abigail admitted, "but she died very suddenly just days after the flood. And she'd been asking questions according to Mrs. Jenkins. Questions about the dam, about Father's business practices." Elijah straightened, alarm flashing across his face. "You never told me this." "I only learned it yesterday when Mrs. Jenkins examined me," Abigail explained. "She mentioned that my mother had come to her with concerns about the dam before the flood, that she'd been gathering information, possibly planning to take action of some kind." The implications were chilling. If Rebecca Montgomery had discovered her husband's role in the dam failure, if she'd been preparing to expose him. "We need to speak with Mrs. Jenkins again," Thomas said, his mind racing. "Get more details about these conversations with your mother." "I've already sent word," Abigail said. "She's coming this afternoon." Thomas nodded approvingly. Abigail was proving remarkably resourceful, taking initiative where once she might have passively accepted circumstances beyond her control. Her time in the cabin away from her father's domineering influence had allowed a natural strength to emerge, one that would serve her well in the challenges ahead. "There's something else we need to consider," Elijah said, his expression troubled. "If Montgomery did have a hand in Rebecca's death, he's even more dangerous than we thought. Approaching him privately could be risky." "All the more reason to ensure we're not alone when we do it," Thomas agreed. "We'll speak with Mrs. Jenkins about that too. Perhaps she and Reverend Wallace could be present." "The Reverend?" Abigail asked, surprised. "He's always been one of Father's strongest supporters." "In public, yes," Thomas acknowledged. "But Wallace has a conscience beneath that pragmatic exterior. And he lost his brother-in-law in the flood, a fact Montgomery might not fully appreciate." They spent the morning refining their plan, determining the best approach to Ezekiel Montgomery and the specific terms they would propose. By noon, a tentative strategy had taken shape. They would arrive at Montgomery's home early Sunday before the other council members and present him with their evidence along with their offer. Mrs. Jenkins and Reverend Wallace would accompany them, providing both witnesses and a buffer against potential violence. If Montgomery agreed to their terms, financial restitution to the victims' families, funding for a town hospital, and his blessing for Abigail and Elijah to marry and start a new life in Denver, they would keep the evidence private. If he refused, they would proceed with their original plan to present everything at the council meeting. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it offered a path that might avoid further bloodshed while still serving justice. Thomas found himself cautiously optimistic, though a lifetime of experience warned him that plans rarely survived contact with reality unaltered. As he prepared a simple lunch for the three of them, Thomas was struck by the strange domesticity that had developed in his once solitary cabin. Abigail set the table while Elijah sliced bread, their movements around each other comfortable and familiar, despite their months of separation. They spoke in soft voices, sharing memories and hopes, occasionally laughing at some private joke. Watching them, Thomas felt a pang of something he couldn't immediately identify. Not quite envy, not quite nostalgia, but a bittersweet awareness of what he'd lost and would never have again. Yet alongside this ache was something unexpected, a quiet satisfaction in having provided a safe harbor where their love could reconnect, where plans for a future could take root. Perhaps this was what healing looked like. He reflected not the absence of pain, but its transformation into something constructive, something that acknowledged loss while embracing possibility. The thought sustained him through lunch and into the early afternoon, when Mrs. Jenkins's wagon once again rattled up to the cabin, bringing with it the midwife's indomitable presence and practical wisdom. Rebecca suspected, Mrs. Jenkins confirmed, settling her substantial frame into a chair by the fire. She had no proof, mind you, but she knew her husband well enough to recognize when he was hiding something. "What exactly did she tell you?" Thomas asked, leaning forward intently. The midwife's weathered face grew solemn with memory. "She came to me 3 days after the flood. Said Ezekiel had been acting strangely relieved rather than shocked when news of the dam failure reached them. He'd moved papers from his study to the safe in the middle of the night, papers she glimpsed briefly, maps of the reservoir and surrounding land." "Did she confront him?" Abigail asked, her voice tight with emotion. "Not directly," Mrs. Jenkins replied. "She was too clever for that. She asked questions instead, innocent-seeming questions about the dam's construction, about which properties had been damaged in the flood, about why the mining operations had been spared when everything downstream was destroyed. And his responses," Elijah prompted, "grew increasingly agitated, warned her to mind her own affairs, that business matters weren't a woman's concern." Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. "That only confirmed her suspicions, of course. Rebecca was no fool for all that Ezekiel treated her as one." Thomas exchanged glances with Elijah, both thinking the same thing. If Rebecca Montgomery had been piecing together her husband's role in the dam failure, she would have represented a significant threat to him. "She fell ill the next day." Mrs. Jenkins continued, her gaze distant with memory. "A sudden fever, vomiting. Ezekiel sent for Dr. Wilson from town, not me, though I'd been the family's midwife and healer for years." "Was that unusual?" Thomas asked. "Very. Rebecca trusted me, had made clear I was to be called if she ever fell ill." The midwife's expression darkened. "By the time I heard she was sick, she was already delirious. By the time I managed to see her, despite Ezekiel's objections, she was beyond help." "You think she was poisoned?" Abigail said, not a question, but a horrified realization. Mrs. Jenkins nodded slowly. "I've seen many fevers in my time, child. Many illnesses that take healthy people quickly. But something about Rebecca's symptoms, they reminded me of cases I'd seen during the war, soldiers who'd eaten certain toxic mushrooms, mistaking them for edible ones." "Death cap mushrooms," Thomas said grimly. "They cause liver failure symptoms, appearing 6 to 12 hours after ingestion. Death follows within days if untreated. And they're easily mistaken for edible varieties," Mrs. Jenkins agreed, "especially when ground up and mixed into food." The implications hung heavy in the air. Abigail's face had gone pale, one hand pressed to her mouth, as if physically holding back her distress. "You believe my father murdered my mother," she whispered finally, to prevent her from exposing his role in the dam failure. "I believe it's possible," Mrs. Jenkins corrected gently. "I have no proof, child, only suspicions that have troubled me these 10 years. Elijah moved to Abigail's side, his arms circling her shoulders protectively. This changes things, he said, looking to Thomas. If Montgomery killed his own wife to conceal his crimes, approaching him privately is even more dangerous than we thought. Thomas agreed, his mind racing to adjust their plans in light of this new information. Rebecca Montgomery's suspicious death added another layer to Ezekiel's crimes, made him even more culpable and potentially more desperate if cornered. We'll need to take additional precautions, he said. More witnesses present when we approach him. Perhaps involve Sheriff Taylor despite his loyalty to Montgomery. The sheriff won't help, Mrs. Jenkins said flatly. He's been in Ezekiel's pocket since the day he pinned on that badge. Then who? Elijah asked. Who in this town has enough influence to stand against Montgomery if things go badly? A thoughtful silence fell, broken finally by Abigail's quiet voice. Judge Carlton, she said. He's retired now, lives on the north edge of town. Father respects him, even fears him a little. He's the only man I've ever seen stand up to Father and not pay a price for it. Thomas considered this. Carlton had been the circuit judge before retiring 5 years ago, a man known for his strict adherence to the law and immunity to bribes or threats. His presence would add legitimacy to their confrontation, might even sway the town council if matters proceeded to that point. Do you think he'd help us? He asked. Get involved in something this contentious. If the evidence is strong enough, Abigail replied. Judge Carlton believes in justice above all else. It's why Father never managed to fully control him, despite trying. I'll speak with him, Mrs. Jenkins offered. He comes to me for his rheumatism medicine. We have an understanding, the judge and I. Something in her tone suggested this understanding went beyond the professional, but Thomas didn't press. Instead, he nodded gratefully. Thank you. Having the judge's support could make all the difference. There's something else, Mrs. Jenkins said, her expression growing more serious. A letter came for you today, Dr. Hayes, from Ezekiel Montgomery. She withdrew an envelope from her pocket, handing it to Thomas. The heavy cream paper bore the Montgomery Mining Company letterhead sealed with wax, impressed with Ezekiel's personal stamp. Thomas broke the seal, unfolding the single sheet within. As he read, his expression darkened, a muscle tightening in his jaw. What is it? Elijah asked tensely. What does he say? He's coming tomorrow, Thomas said, looking up from the letter. Mass Sunday, tomorrow morning after church. He says it's time Abigail returned home, that she's been here long enough. Abigail paled, her hand moving protectively to her belly. But the baby isn't due for weeks yet. Apparently that doesn't matter, Thomas replied grimly. He writes that he's made arrangements for your care in town under Dr. Wilson's supervision. No, Elijah said firmly, his arm tightening around Abigail. We won't let him take her. We may not have a choice, Thomas cautioned. Legally, Abigail is still under her father's authority. If he arrives with the sheriff, then we need to move up our plans, Mrs. Jenkins interjected practically. Confront him tomorrow when he comes, not wait for Sunday. Thomas nodded slowly, his mind racing to adjust. We'll lose the public forum of the council meeting, but gain the element of surprise. He won't expect us to have evidence ready, won't have prepared counters to our accusations. Or witnesses eliminated, Elijah added darkly, thinking of William Reynolds' fate. I'll fetch Judge Carlton tonight, Mrs. Jenkins said, rising with determination. And Reverend Wallace, too. They'll both be here by morning. And I'll send word to Nathaniel, Thomas agreed. Have him bring all our evidence. As plans shifted and accelerated around her, Abigail remained silent, her face a study in conflicting emotions, fear, resolve, grief, and something else that took Thomas a moment to identify: relief. The confrontation that had been looming for days would soon be over one way or another. The uncertainty at least would end. Rest now, he told her gently. Tomorrow will demand all your strength. She nodded, allowing Elijah to help her to her feet. As they moved toward the bedroom, Thomas was struck by the quiet dignity in her bearing, the way she straightened her shoulders despite the burden of her advanced pregnancy and the emotional weight of all she'd learned. Ezekiel Montgomery's daughter had steel in her spine, not the cold, unyielding metal of her father's ambition, but something tempered by compassion and strengthened by love. Whatever happened tomorrow, Thomas had no doubt she would face it with the same grace she'd shown throughout her stay in his cabin. Mrs. Jenkins departed soon after, her wagon rattling down the path toward town, laden with purpose and urgent missions. Thomas and Elijah spent the remainder of the afternoon preparing the cabin for tomorrow's confrontation. moving furniture to create space for the additional visitors, ensuring the evidence was organized and accessible. Neither man spoke much, each lost in his own thoughts about what the morning might bring. The possibility of violence hung unspoken between them, a shadow neither wished to acknowledge, but both were aware might materialize. As dusk fell, Thomas retreated to the locked music room while Elijah sat with Abigail. Inside the sanctuary of memory, he stood before Sophia's portrait, seeking guidance or perhaps absolution for what was to come. Tomorrow it ends, he told her quietly. One way or another we'll have justice for what happened to you and Emma. The painted eyes gave no answer, but as Thomas turned to leave, his gaze fell on the violin case closed and gathering dust on the side table. On impulse, he opened it, lifting the instrument from its velvet nest. The wood felt warm beneath his fingers, alive in a way it hadn't for years. Without conscious thought, he raised the violin to his chin, positioning the bow over the strings. The first notes came hesitantly, then with growing confidence as muscle memory took over. The melody was one Sophia had composed for Emma's 4th birthday, a simple, joyful tune that had once filled their Denver home with laughter and dance. As he played, Thomas closed his eyes, allowing the music to wash through him, not as a reminder of loss this time, but as a connection to what had been good and true in his life. For the first time in 6 years, the memories brought more comfort than pain, more gratitude than grief. When the final note faded into silence, Thomas opened his eyes to find Abigail standing in the doorway, her expression one of wonder and shared understanding. "That was beautiful," she said softly, like a prayer. Thomas carefully returned the violin to its case. "Perhaps it was. My mother used to say music reaches places words cannot." Abigail continued, entering the room slowly, "that it speaks directly to the soul, bypassing the mind's defenses." "Your mother was wise," Thomas said, closing the violin case with gentle hands. Sophia believed the same. Abigail moved to the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. "May I?" she asked hesitantly. Thomas nodded, surprised to find he welcomed the idea of music filling the room again. "Please." Abigail settled onto the bench, adjusting her position to accommodate her pregnant belly. For a moment she sat still, hands poised above the keys as if gathering courage, or perhaps communing with the instrument. Then she began to play a piece Thomas recognized immediately as Chopin's Nocturne, in E-flat major, one of Sophia's favorites. Her technique was flawless, her interpretation sensitive and nuanced. As the melancholy beauty of the music filled the room, Thomas felt something shift within him, a loosening of the tight knot of anger and grief that had defined him for so long. In its place spread a bittersweet acceptance, a recognition that life continued to offer moments of beauty, even amid loss. When Abigail finished the final chord lingering in the air between them, neither spoke for a long moment. Words seemed inadequate following such communion through music. "Thank you," Thomas said finally, "for bringing music back to this room." Abigail smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "And thank you for sharing it with me, for everything you've done these past weeks." The simple gratitude touched Thomas deeply. Whatever happened tomorrow with Ezekiel Montgomery, he realized his life had already been changed by Abigail's presence in his home. She had awakened parts of himself he'd thought long dead: compassion, connection, even hope. "We should rest," he said, practical concerns reasserting themselves. "Tomorrow will demand much from all of us." Abigail nodded, rising from the piano bench with some difficulty. As she passed Thomas on her way to the door, she paused, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, "know that you've already given me something precious, a glimpse of what family should be, of what I hope to create with Elijah and our child." Before Thomas could respond, she continued to the door, leaving him alone with her words and the lingering notes of Chopin still echoing in his heart. Dawn broke gray and sullen over Whispering Pines, clouds hanging low over the mountains, promising rain later in the day. Thomas woke before first light, having slept poorly despite his exhaustion. Too many possibilities, too many potential outcomes to tomorrow's confrontation had chased through his mind, keeping rest at bay. He rose quietly, stoking the fire and setting coffee to boil. Elijah joined him soon after, his face showing similar signs of a restless night. "Abigail?" Thomas asked. "Still sleeping," Elijah replied. "Finally around dawn. She was up most of the night, too uncomfortable to rest." Thomas frowned, concern flickering through him. "Physical discomfort or emotional?" "Both, I think. Her back's been paining her and the baby's very active." Elijah accepted the coffee Thomas offered, his hands cupping the mug for warmth. And she's afraid, though she tries not to show it, afraid of what her father might do when cornered. With good reason, Thomas acknowledged. We'll need to be prepared for anything. They discussed strategies as the sky lightened outside, considering various scenarios and how to respond to each. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching, not a single rider, but several. Thomas moved to the window, tension coiling in his gut. 3 riders, he reported. Mrs. Jenkins, Reverend Wallace, and Judge Carlton, I believe. Elijah joined him at the window, confirming the identification. They're early. Church doesn't let out for hours yet. Better early than late, Thomas said, reaching for his coat. Let's greet them. Outside, the air was damp and cool, promising rain by afternoon. Mrs. Jenkins dismounted with surprising agility for a woman of her years, while Reverend Wallace helped Judge Carlton from his horse. The judge was older than Thomas remembered, his once imposing frame now stooped with age, but his eyes remained sharp and assessing as they took in the cabin and its surroundings. Dr. Hayes, he greeted, his voice still carrying the authoritative tone that had commanded courtrooms across the territory. Martha tells me you have a matter of some urgency to discuss. I do, Your Honor, Thomas replied, shaking the offered hand. Thank you for coming on such short notice. Justice doesn't keep convenient hours, Doctor. The judge's gaze shifted to Elijah, narrowing slightly. And you must be Johnson. Martha mentioned you'd returned to Whispering Pines despite Montgomery's disinclination toward your presence. Yes, sir, Elijah confirmed, standing straighter under the judge's scrutiny. Some matters are worth the risk. Indeed. Carlton's expression softened slightly. I knew your Uncle Joseph, a good man, honest and hardworking. His concerns about that dam were well-founded, as events proved. That's part of what we need to discuss, Thomas interjected. Please come inside. We have much to share before Montgomery arrives. In the cabin's main room, Abigail had risen and dressed, her face pale but composed as she greeted their visitors. Judge Carlton's eyebrows rose at the sight of her advanced pregnancy, but he offered a courtly bow. Miss Montgomery, he said, it seems you've been at the center of quite a storm, both figuratively and, if I understand correctly, literally as well. More than I knew, Your Honor, Abigail replied quietly, until very recently. Over coffee and the bread Mrs. Jenkins had brought, Thomas and Elijah presented their evidence against Ezekiel Montgomery. The engineering reports, the maps showing how the floodwaters had been deliberately channeled, Joseph Johnson's damning letter, and finally Mrs. Jenkins' suspicions regarding Rebecca Montgomery's death. The judge listened without interruption, his weathered face giving little away as he examined each document, each piece of testimony. Reverend Wallace was less composed, his expression shifting from disbelief to horror as the full scope of Montgomery's actions became clear. This is most disturbing, the Reverend said when they had finished. If true, it represents a level of calculation and disregard for human life that is truly shocking. If true, Elijah repeated, an edge to his voice. What reason would we have to fabricate such accusations? Peace, young man, Judge Carlton interjected. The Reverend's skepticism is appropriate. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and what you've presented, while compelling, remains largely circumstantial. Except for my uncle's letter, Elijah pointed out. He witnessed Montgomery's men tampering with the dam, heard them admit they were acting on his orders. A powerful piece of evidence, yes, the judge agreed, but written by a man now deceased who cannot be questioned or cross-examined. He held up a hand as Elijah began to protest. I'm not dismissing it, Mr. Johnson, merely assessing its weight in legal terms. And Rebecca's death, Mrs. Jenkins asked quietly. What of my suspicions there? The judge's expression grew graver. If Ezekiel Montgomery did indeed poison his wife to prevent her from exposing his role in the dam failure, that would elevate this matter from criminal negligence to premeditated murder. But again, we have suspicions rather than proof. So you're saying we have no case? Thomas said, disappointment evident in his voice. I'm saying, Judge Carlton corrected carefully, that confronting Montgomery privately as you propose may be more effective than a public accusation that could be dismantled in court. The evidence you've gathered, while not definitive in legal terms, creates a compelling narrative that most reasonable people would find disturbing. And Montgomery is nothing if not reasonable when his interests are at stake, Reverend Wallace added, understanding dawning in his expression. You're suggesting we use this evidence as leverage, not as a legal case. Precisely, the judge confirmed. Present him with the evidence along with your terms. Make clear that whether this remains private or becomes public knowledge is entirely dependent on his cooperation. Blackmail, Elijah said flatly. Justice, Judge Carlton countered, administered differently than in a courtroom perhaps, but justice nonetheless. 8 lives were lost in that flood, Mr. Johnson. Your uncle Dr. Hayes's family, others who had no voice. If this approach secures some measure of restitution for their deaths, some acknowledgement of responsibility, is that not preferable to a legal battle that might well end in Montgomery's acquittal? The pragmatic wisdom in the judge's assessment was undeniable. Thomas exchanged glances with Elijah, seeing reluctant agreement in the younger man's eyes. They had hoped for more, for public vindication for Montgomery to face the full weight of the law, but perhaps this compromise represented the most realistic path to justice. What about Abigail and the baby? Elijah asked, his primary concern evident. How do we ensure their safety, their freedom from Montgomery's control? That, Judge Carlton said, is where I can be most useful. As a former territorial judge, I retain certain authorities, including the power to officiate marriages. Abigail's eyes widened, understanding immediately. If Elijah and I were legally married, then your father's authority over you would be superseded by your husband's, the judge confirmed. And while that may sound archaic to modern sensibilities, in this case, it would serve to protect you from being forced to return to your father's home. You would marry us? Elijah asked, hope and disbelief mingling in his voice. Here now. If that is your wish, Judge Carlton replied, and if you both understand that such a union, while legally binding, may carry significant social consequences given the prevailing attitudes in our territory. He didn't need to elaborate. Mixed-race marriages, while not explicitly forbidden by territorial law, were rare and often met with hostility, particularly in small communities like Whispering Pines. We understand, Abigail said firmly, reaching for Elijah's hand. We've already faced those consequences to some degree, but being legally bound would offer protection not just for me, but for our child. The judge nodded, satisfied with her resolve. Then we shall proceed before Montgomery arrives. Reverend Wallace, I trust you have no objections to witnessing this union despite its unconventional circumstances. The Reverend hesitated only briefly before nodding. God's love transcends human boundaries, he said quietly. Who am I to place limitations where he does not? As preparations for the impromptu wedding began, Mrs. Jenkins arranging flowers from the garden, Reverend Wallace consulting his prayer book, Thomas retreated to his study, needing a moment to process the swiftly changing situation. What had begun as a plan for confrontation and justice had evolved into something more complex, more hopeful, a union that might offer Abigail and Elijah protection while still holding Montgomery accountable for his crimes. It wasn't the resolution he'd envisioned during 6 years of gathering evidence, of nursing his grief and rage. But perhaps it was a better one, a path that honored the dead while serving the living, that sought justice without perpetuating harm. Thomas was still contemplating this unexpected turn when a soft knock at the study door drew his attention. Abigail stood there, a sprig of late wildflowers in her hair, her borrowed dress smoothed as best she could manage over her swollen belly. Dr. Hayes, she said softly, we're ready to begin the ceremony. But before we do, I wanted to ask. She hesitated, gathering courage. Would you stand with me in place of my father, I mean? Give me away, as they say. The request caught Thomas entirely off guard. Me? But surely Reverend Wallace or even Judge Carlton. No, Abigail interrupted gently. It should be you. These past weeks you've shown me more true fatherly care than Ezekiel Montgomery has in 20 years. You've given me shelter, protection, respect. You've listened when I spoke and valued what I had to say. Her eyes filled with tears, though her voice remained steady. If not for you, I might never have found the courage to imagine a different future for myself and my child. Thomas felt something shift within him, the hard shell of grief that had encased his heart for 6 years cracking further, allowing emotions he'd long suppressed to surface. Pride in this young woman's strength, joy in her happiness despite all obstacles, and yes, a paternal affection he'd thought forever buried with Emma. I would be honored, he said simply, offering his arm. The ceremony that followed was brief but profound in its sincerity. In the main room of the cabin, with Judge Carlton officiating, Reverend Wallace offering prayers, and Mrs. Jenkins beaming approval, Elijah and Abigail exchanged vows that transcended their circumstances, promises of love, fidelity, and mutual support through whatever challenges lay ahead. When the judge pronounced them husband and wife, the small gathering broke into spontaneous applause. Elijah kissed his bride with tender reverence, his hands framing her face as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Thomas watched them, a complex mixture of emotions washing through him. Happiness for the young couple, certainly. Pride in having played a role in their union, but also a bittersweet awareness of all he'd lost, the family celebrations. He would never again experience the milestones Sophia and Emma would never reach. Yet alongside this familiar ache was something new, a sense of purpose, renewed of life, continuing beyond tragedy. In helping Abigail and Elijah forge their future, he had found a connection to his own, a thread of meaning that stretched from past to present and beyond. The moment of reflection was broken by the sound of horses approaching, multiple riders moving at speed up the path to the cabin. All heads turned toward the window, tension instantly replacing celebration. "Montgomery," Thomas said grimly, "and not alone." Judge Carlton moved to the window, peering out with practiced assessment. 4 riders. Montgomery, Sheriff Taylor, and 2 others I don't recognize, armed from the look of it. Elijah's arm tightened protectively around Abigail. Hired guns, most likely. He's not taking chances. "Nor should we," the judge replied, turning back to the room. "Places everyone. Remember our strategy. Let me and Reverend Wallace do the initial talking. Our positions lend authority that may give Montgomery pause." Thomas nodded, moving to retrieve the folder of evidence from his desk. As he did, he caught Abigail's eye across the room. Despite the fear evident in her expression, she stood tall beside her new husband, one hand resting protectively on her belly, the other clasped firmly in Elijah's. Whatever happened next, Thomas realized, had already been transformed by the simple ceremony they just witnessed. Abigail was no longer Montgomery's daughter to command, but Elijah's wife to protect. The child she carried was no longer a shameful secret to be hidden away, but the first member of a new family founded on love rather than control. The sound of boots on the porch announced their visitor's arrival. A heavy fist pounded on the door, followed by Ezekiel Montgomery's commanding voice. "Hayes, open up. I've come for my daughter." Judge Carlton nodded to Thomas, who moved to the door, drawing a deep breath to steady himself before opening it to face the man who had destroyed his family 6 years before, and who now threatened to destroy Abigail's future if they didn't stop him. The confrontation that would determine all their fates was about to begin.